December of 1994, Joanne Katranak told friends about a disturbing telephone call she received from someone she had never met.
Stop calling here!
3 days later, Joanne Katranak and her 4-month-old son, Alex, disappeared without a trace. Telephone records could not identify the caller, but investigators suspected that the incident might hold the key to their disappearance. Joanne Katranak was a strikingly attractive young woman, a good student, and an outstanding athlete who had hoped to pursue a career in the fashion and beauty industry.
She was very concerned about her appearance. She was very, very pretty. And, I mean, she made sure every hair was in place before she even, took the garbage out. And she was a very loving child.
Joanne was known to family and friends for her upbeat personality and optimism, qualities that were tested when her first marriage ended in a painful divorce. But in 1992, she met Andrew Katranak, a 38-year-old building contractor who was 14 years her senior. Despite the age difference, the two hit it off immediately.
Andy was kind of on his own. He had been in a relationship. Joanne was in a relationship, and so they had something in common. And they, as I said, became really good friends. And then, of course, it escalated into more than friendship.
After a brief courtship, Andrew and Joanne married, and the couple moved into Andrew's home in the small working-class town of Catasauqua, Pennsylvania. 15 months later, Joanne gave birth to a healthy baby boy named Alex.
I have pictures of me holding Alex in my office, and he just was smiling all the time, and he was big for his age. He, nice healthy baby, and it was just a joy to have around.
Hello, Veronica?
On December 15, 1994, Joanne Katranak called her mother-in-law at 1:15 in the afternoon. Joanne said she and the baby would be right over to pick her up so that the three of them could go Christmas shopping together.
We'll be over in about 15 minutes.
But
Bye.
Joanne and the baby never arrived. Andrew Katranak came home from work around 6:30. He was surprised to find that his wife and son were not home. The baby's diaper bag was missing. Joanne's purse was gone too, so were their winter coats. There was nothing out of place inside the home. No money or valuables were missing. The only thing Andrew noticed was that the hinge on the basement door was pried from the door jamb, and a telephone line in the basement had been cut. 4 hours later, at 10:30 that night, Andrew Katranak called police to report his wife and son missing. Relatives found Joanne's car down the street in the parking lot of a local bar, not in its usual location in the alley behind her house. Although it was locked, Joanne's keys were inside the car. On the back headrest were several strands of long, blonde hair, which did not belong to Joanne since she was brunette. On the distal end of the hairs were microscopic traces of dried blood. DNA analysis revealed that the blood was either from Joanne Katranak or her son, Alex. Investigators also began to check out Andrew's alibi, that he had been at work all day on a construction site.
He's the last person that sees her alive. The vast majority of homicides are committed by a person who the victim knows. So you cannot just eliminate that by accepting that an individual says, well, I wasn't there, I was at work.
They said that he must have something to do with the fact that she's disappeared, and the police actually said that, oh, she probably ran away with someone. in a million years, Joanne would never have run away. And I was quite angry with the police that they accused Andy.
Days passed, then weeks. And when the banks reported there had been no activity on Joanne Katranak's credit cards, it was becoming painfully clear that Joanne and Alex had been the victims of foul play. Christmas passed, and so did New Year's of 1995, still with no sign of 26-year-old Joanne Katranak or her infant son, Alex. The Katranaks lived on a busy street across from a local bar. Neighbors said they saw nothing suspicious on the day of Joanne's disappearance, and police were skeptical that Joanne and her baby could have been abducted in broad daylight. But 4 months after they were reported missing, the worst fears of the police were confirmed. In a remote stretch of rural farmland, a farmer plowing his field noticed what first appeared to be a bundle of clothing. When he looked closer, he discovered the decomposed body of a woman lying on her back, and on her chest, a baby. About 40 feet away was a baby rattle shaped like a phone. It was Alex Katranak's favorite toy.
From then on, our life changed. So anything after that did not have as much of an impact as when they were found. The 4 months they were missing was absolutely the most painful time in my life, of all our lives.
Close to the bodies was a milk bottle and diaper bag, with 2 long blonde hairs still attached. The hairs were microscopically similar to the hairs found on the headrest of Joanne Katranak's car. Since Joanne Katranak's jewelry was found with the body, the motive did not appear to be robbery. An autopsy discovered that Joanne Katranak had been shot once in the face at point-blank range with a .22 caliber pistol. She had also been beaten.
Due to the fact that she sustained 1 gunshot wound to the face and then approximately 19 blows to the head, led us to believe that the gun probably had jammed, and because of the gun jamming, the assailant had to resort to blunt object and beat her about the head.
The coroner was not sure whether little Alex died from exposure or had been suffocated.
I can remember till this day seeing that infant being lifted off of the abdomen of his mother. It certainly tugged at our heartstrings. You know, it brought a tear to my eye. And if nothing more, it certainly galvanized the law enforcement community and got us moving in the right direction.
The bodies were found in an extremely remote area, about 15 miles from the Katranak's home, which told investigators something important about the killer.
The victims were on a trail, so after inspecting the scene very thoroughly, we felt very strongly that the person who had killed Joanne and Alex Katranak had been in this area before and was familiar with these trails.
The trails were used by horseback riders, and Andrew Katranak told police that one of his former girlfriends managed a horse stable, the Silver Shadow Farms, just a mile down the road. Her name was Patricia Rohrer. She and Andrew lived together for 2 years in the late 1980s and again briefly in 1991. When they broke up, Patricia Rohrer moved to North Carolina, had a child with another man, and had been living there ever since. When police questioned Patricia Rohrer at her home in North Carolina, they immediately noticed that she was a brunette and not blonde.
Patricia Rohrer?
Like the hairs found in Joanne's car and on the diaper bag.
Can we ask you a few questions?
Were you in Pennsylvania during the week of December 15 last year?
No.
Rohrer said she was in North Carolina on the day of Joanne's disappearance, 500 miles away from Pennsylvania, and had witnesses to prove it.
All right, thanks for your time.
I think she gave us something like 4 or 5 alibis as to where she was at. One, she was at a private club. One, she was out buying feed for horses. One, she was at a tanning salon.
But Andrew Katranak had another surprise for investigators. He remembered that Patricia Rohrer called his home just 3 days before his wife and son disappeared.
Hello?
Joanne answered the phone, and when Patricia Rohrer identified herself, the two argued.
Look, Andy has told you to stop calling here. We have a baby now. We're happy together. Just leave us alone. Stop calling here.
Patricia Rohrer denied making that call, and her home telephone records confirmed her story. With brunette hair, an alibi, and no evidence she called the Katranaks' home, investigators feared they had hit a dead end. Investigators wanted to know as accurately as possible when Joanne and Alex Katranak were killed. Although the bodies were discovered 4 months after they disappeared, it wasn't clear how long the bodies had been in the field. The bodies contained evidence of insect activity, and police asked Dr. K-Jun Kim, a forensic entomologist at Pennsylvania State University, for an analysis of what the insect activity revealed about the time of death.
This case was rather complicated because 2 bodies involved, 2 victims involved. And the same time that a body were laying on the ground in the wild in wintertime. And so that there are different waves of insect invasions to the body.
First, Dr. Kim found the hard outer shell of the Califera lividia, shown here magnified 150 times. This species of blowfly had progressed to its final stage of development. Dr. Kim also found another species, Sinomyopsis cadaverina, that was just beginning its 3rd and final stage of development. These 2 factors told Dr. Kim that the bodies had been in the field for at least 51 days, since early February. And when Dr. Kim looked at the local weather conditions, he also noticed another important piece of information. Between December 21st and the 28th, local temperatures were unseasonably warm, reaching 50 degrees, the perfect conditions for these 2 species to mate and lay eggs. Investigators now knew that the bodies had not been placed in the field recently. They were there since February, and possibly as early as December, the time of the abduction. Patricia Rohrer's telephone records revealed that she made long-distance telephone calls from home almost every day. But there were no calls made between December 11th and the 16th, suggesting she was not in North Carolina when Joanne Katranak and her son were abducted. Patricia said she was at the Cowboys nightclub in North Carolina on the night of the abduction. A state law requires all patrons of the club to sign in, but Patricia Rohrer was not signed in on that date. Patricia Rohrer also denied owning a .22 caliber pistol, and a search of her home turned up nothing. But one of her old boyfriends contradicted her. He told police Patricia Rohrer owned a .22 caliber chrome-plated semi-automatic weapon like this one, and said the gun had a unique characteristic.
An unusual feature about the gun, he stated, was the fact that you fire 1 shot out of the gun and the gun would jam. You couldn't fire a 2nd shot. Well, that really caught our attention, of course.
But police still had the problem with the blonde hair found at the scene and in the victim's car, since Patricia Rohrer was a brunette.
And she looked at the warrant, she saw we were looking for dirty blonde hair. She's sitting there as a brunette saying, "Who's got dirty blonde hair? I don't have dirty blonde hair."
We were sitting in our office one day and we were discussing how could we determine what color Patricia Rohrer's hair was at the time of the murder. And we both agreed that the only way to do that was to try to obtain a picture of her in and around the time of the murder.
After a little digging, police discovered that Patricia Rohrer competed in a horse show in Guthrie, Oklahoma in December of 1994 and had won a prize at the competition. The pictures of the winners that day showed Patricia Rohrer with bleached blonde hair. The photo was taken just 11 days before Joanne and Alex Katranak disappeared. But prosecutors needed more than just a photograph. They needed to know for certain whether the blonde hair at the crime scene belonged to Patricia Rohrer. The blonde hairs found on the diaper bag next to Joanne Katranak's body and in her car did not contain enough root material for traditional DNA testing. Investigators' only hope was to try a new type of DNA test, one that had never been admitted into evidence in a Pennsylvania trial, something called mitochondrial DNA. Traditional DNA testing analyzes the nucleus of the cell, found in abundance in bodily fluids and tissue. But outside of the cell nucleus are what are known as mitochondria, cells that can be identified, although not as precisely as in traditional DNA testing.
Most hairs from crime scenes have very, very little amounts of DNA. However, there's more mitochondrial DNA in those hairs. There's more copies of mitochondrial DNA in those hairs than nuclear DNA. Therefore, in hairs obtained from crime scenes, most of the time, we can obtain a mitochondrial DNA sequence where we would fail with nuclear DNA analysis.
First, scientists washed the hair in detergent, then added a digest buffer to eliminate everything except the cells to be analyzed. In this gel-like matter is the DNA of a killer. To identify the DNA sequence, a PCR test was conducted, and the mitochondrial DNA sequences from the blonde hair matched Patricia Rohrer's DNA profile. This was enough to convince prosecutors that Patricia Rohrer was at the crime scene and inside Joanne Katranak's car. Patricia Rohrer was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Prosecutors believe that Patricia Rohrer was in Pennsylvania and not North Carolina when she called for Andrew Katranak. But when Joanne answered the phone, Patricia's hopes of meeting Andrew for old time's sake were quickly dashed.
We have a baby now. We're happy together. Just leave us alone. Stop calling here. Hello?
And when Joanne hung up, prosecutors believe Rohrer got angry and sought revenge. For the next 3 days, Rohrer stalked the Katranak's home to observe Joanne's daily routine. On December 15th, sometime after 1 p.m., Patricia Rohrer broke into the Katranak's basement and overheard Joanne on the telephone with her mother-in-law.
We're about ready to leave, okay? We'll be over at about 1:30. I just have to get the baby ready.
Uh-huh. Right. The mall. Okay, 15 minutes. Bye.
When Rohrer heard Katranak was leaving, she decided to wait for them outside in the alley and cut the telephone line to prevent any further calls.
Do as I say and don't make any noise.
At gunpoint, Patricia Rohrer forced Joanne into her car, ordering her to drive to the remote farmland. Patricia Rohrer fired a single shot into Joanne Katranak, and when the pistol jammed, beat her to death. The baby was left on his mother's chest. The murder weapon was never found, but Patricia Rohrer left 2 bleached blonde hairs at the crime scene and some hair stained with the victim's blood in Joanne's car as she drove it back to town. At the trial, Patricia Rohra's defense team scoffed at the notion that an alleged argument she had with Joanne Katranak was a believable motive for murder.
And the defense was saying, come on, that can't be a motive. Normal people don't act like that. And he was right. Normal people don't act like that. But this particular person was not normal and acted just that way.
After 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Patricia Rohra guilty of both murders, and she was sentenced to life in prison.
She's going to have to live with what she did. And I hope her life isn't happy, because mine isn't. I tried to get on with my life, and I've made some, strides. But you never, ever get over the loss of a child or a grandchild.
The case was a first in the state of Pennsylvania and was only the third time in the United States that a conviction was secured with mitochondrial DNA.
This case is a classic example of the power of mitochondrial DNA. The only forensic evidence obtained in this case really were the 3 hairs from the crime scene. 3 hairs that, unless you look very hard for, you might very easily pass over.
I'd have to say this, that in all my years in law enforcement, the Katranak investigation is one of the finest pieces of police work that I've had the pleasure of being involved in. There were many unique challenges to this investigation. The technology that we employed in the development of at least one key piece of forensic evidence was literally 21st century technology in the 20th century.
All homes have a history, which includes the memories, hopes, and dreams of all who have lived there. But this home in a quiet, upscale neighborhood in suburban New York held something more. In a steel drum, stored in a crawl space, was a secret that someone had hoped would last a lifetime. September 2nd, 1999 was moving day for the Cohen family in Jericho, New York. Before leaving that day, Ronald Cohen noticed that the sanitation workers hadn't picked up all of his trash. A note on a large steel drum said it wasn't removed because of its weight. Cohen had no idea what was inside, since it had been in a crawl space in his home since the day he moved in 9 years earlier. When he broke the seal, Cohen was overcome by a terrible stench. Inside, he saw what appeared to be a human hand and a lady's shoe. Local police transported the drum to the Nassau County morgue, where all of its contents were carefully removed for forensic examination. Inside were the mummified remains of a young woman. There were also some plastic pellets, a green plastic flower stem with leaves, and a woman's pocketbook which was submerged in a mysterious brownish-green liquid at the bottom of the drum. The liquid had virtually destroyed the contents of the pocketbook, which might have identified the victim. The cause of death appeared to be blunt force trauma to the head.
What was most noteworthy to the body and the cause of death were that there were 10 different injuries called lacerations to the back and upper part of her head. There were multiple fractures to the skull. In some areas, the skull was broken into small pieces. There also was blood staining to these areas of injuries, indicating that they occurred while she was alive.
But who was this murdered woman? The medical examiner determined that the woman was either white or Hispanic, between 20 and 30 years of age. She stood approximately 5 feet tall. She also had some unusual dental work.
It didn't appear to be dental work that was performed in the United States. It led me to believe that it was from a South American country.
When Dr. Catanese x-rayed the body, he made a shocking discovery: a 17-inch fetus, a close to full-term baby boy. 3 pieces of jewelry were removed from the body, 2 rings and a locket that was inscribed to Patrice, love, Uncle Phil. The first discovery would come from the barrel itself. There were several coded numbers on the drum. One was as good as a fingerprint. It led to a chemical company in Linden, New Jersey. Company records indicated that the drum was manufactured in 1965. Now, 34 years later, it shows up as someone's makeshift coffin. A 55-gallon steel drum concealed in a crawl space of a suburban New York home revealed shocking evidence of a homicide. The most recent owner said it had been in the crawl space since the day he moved in 1990. The owner before that told police the same thing and said it never occurred to him to open the container since there were chemical labels on the side. The woman's purse found in the liquid at the bottom of the drum contained some papers and an address book. The pages were illegible since the liquid had reduced the paper to little more than pulp. They were all sent to a forensic document examiner for analysis.
It was so heavily and thickly encrusted with a brownish yellow slime. It was like a jelly-like substance, and it coated everything. And when I touched the evidence with my gloves on, I could see it just came right off of my hands.
The items had to be placed in a forensic drying cabinet for several days to draw out the moisture. When dry, they could be examined with a video spectral comparator, or VSC, which combines advanced digital engineering with a full range of infrared light sources in order to visualize writing that is not discernible with the naked eye. This technology can show where alterations have been made on a check with the various light sources. Under an infrared luminescence setting, the different ink will glow. Magnification can also detect when official documents have been altered. 2 pages of a legal contract appear the same, but under ultraviolet light, it reveals that one of the pages was added later. Indented impressions left behind become visible with oblique or side lighting. Light from behind or transmitted light can show what's written under correction fluid. After the pages from the barrel were dry, the results were disappointing. The liquid had removed the ink from the pages. But after hours of meticulous and delicate work under infrared camera filters, the document examiner started to see some names and addresses in the address book.
As I put it under the machine and tried the various filters and lights, some names and phone numbers and addresses started to come up in the book. It was actually quite amazing to see writing appear from within the pages of this book that had been submerged in these fluids for 30-some-odd years.
But the information in the address book was 30 years old, too. And when investigators dialed the telephone numbers, the individuals had long since moved. Facing an apparent dead end, investigators turned their attention to the family who owned the home in the 1960s, the time frame in which the steel drum had been manufactured. The owner in those years was a man named Howard Elkins, who is now retired and living in Boca Raton, Florida.
And we have people in the neighborhood who are long-term residents say, yeah, he was involved in some plastics company in Manhattan.
The plastic connection rang alarm bells, since a plastic leaf and plastic pellets were found in the drum, along with the murdered woman. In the 1960s, Howard Elkins was part owner of the Melrose Plastic Company in Manhattan. The company manufactured plastic plants and trees. As investigators made plans to interview Howard Elkins in Florida, the address book from the drum started to reveal more names and more secrets. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together in the search for the identity of the murdered pregnant woman found in the metal drum. The serial numbers on the drum led investigators to a chemical company based in New Jersey.
I went there with a detective from our lab who has some knowledge of chemicals. We went there and we showed them the pellets and we showed them the green material. Showed them pictures of the barrel.
The chemical company identified the green liquid in the bottom of the drum as a dye, a halogen green dye used to color the bases on plastic flowers and trees, but it hadn't been manufactured since 1971. The pellets in the drum were the type used in making plastic leaves and flowers, like the plastic leaf found with the body. The local newspaper coverage of the unidentified woman in the steel drum led to an anonymous telephone call to the Nassau County Police.
He tells us about the drum, where it comes from. He tells us that was the chemicals that they used when they were mixing the bases for these artificial trees. So he puts all this together. He puts everything in perspective for us.
The caller did not know the identity of the dead woman, but said that Howard Elkins was having an affair in the 1960s with an Hispanic woman who worked for him in his plastic factory.
So we now have things to talk to him about other than the fact that there was a barrel found under his house.
When police flew to Boca Raton, Florida to speak with Howard Elkins, he wasn't entirely cooperative.
Did you ever use this type of a barrel in your business? No, we never had any barrels like that.
No, we never had any barrels like that.
Did you ever use a dye known as halogen green?
No, we never used the chemical. We had no need to use the chemical.
There were plastic pellets found in the barrel, and we believe that they were used in your business. Is that right?
I don't know what they would have been used for.
He lied to us. We knew he was lying to us within 5 minutes of the interview.
I asked him at one point, did you ever have an affair while you were working? And he kind of surprised us, and he said yes.
But then we went into what was her name? I don't know. Can you describe her? It was 30 years ago. I said, you can't even describe her. Was she tall? Was she short? Was she fat? Was she skinny? Was she Spanish? I don't remember.
After about 20 minutes of this, I had removed from my briefcase a kit, and I asked him if he would give me permission for me to take a swab from the inside of his mouth for DNA purposes, to see if he in fact was the father of that baby. He told us no. He said he didn't think he would allow that.
The interview was interrupted by a phone call from Elkins' wife. Elkins asked the police to leave, saying he wanted to speak with her privately.
This is private. You're going to have to leave.
After he asked us to leave, we told him that we would. I said that there was not a doubt in our mind that he was involved in this. And I stood up and I stood right in front of him and I said, we're going to leave now, Mr. Elkins. But I'm going to get a court order. I'm going to come back with that court order. And I'm going to take your blood. And I'm going to match your blood up to the dead baby and that dead girl. And I'm going to come back here and arrest you for murder and put you in jail for the rest of your life. He nodded his head, and he opened the door and asked us to leave.
As police left to get the court order, Howard Elkins left to go shopping. He purchased a shotgun and some ammunition. Howard Elkins was found inside a neighbor's garage by police and his own son. a shotgun between his legs, a fatal self-inflicted wound to his head. The 70-year-old retired plastics executive left no final note of explanation. After his suicide, investigators took a sample of Howard Elkins' blood and sent it to LabCorp, a North Carolina DNA testing facility.
When we're testing for paternity, we look for shared DNA bands between the child or the fetus and the alleged father.
In the case of the fetus found in the drum, there were obstacles to overcome. The tissue samples from the fetus were very badly degraded after 30 years. A technique called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, allowed scientists to amplify the existing DNA, making an analysis possible.
This is the DNA banding pattern from the fetus. This is the DNA banding pattern from Mr. Elkins. At every region of the DNA that we tested, the fetus and Mr. Elkins have a band in common. Mr. Elkins could not be excluded with a 99.93% probability of paternity.
Although the crime was solved, one mystery remained: the identity of the woman in the drum. The small address book that had been submerged in the green liquid in the bottom of the drum was finally starting to tell a story. 30-year-old secrets on blank pages that were now readable with the latest in forensic technology.
I kept looking through the book, and on this page, on the second line, I found the name Mr. Elkins and the address in Manhattan with a phone number.
On another page, barely readable, were the words Residencia Nombre, a resident alien number, and the address and telephone number of someone named Kathy Andrade. Investigators were surprised to learn that after 30 years, she was still living in the same apartment with the same telephone number. Kathy Andrade knew immediately the identity of the pregnant young woman in the drum. She was a student in her English class, Reina Angelica Marroquin from El Salvador.
This lady almost immediately went to tears. She told us that she knew Angelica Marroquin, that she was one of the more lovely people that she ever knew, and that she disappeared 30 years ago.
Kathy Andrade never knew what happened to her friend, Reina Marroquin, although she feared she had met with foul play.
And I was in shock, and I said, oh my God, you know, it's hard to believe that these things can happen.
Reina Marroquin came to the United States in 1966 and lived here in a modest room in a Catholic home for single women. She attended classes at the High School of Fashion Industry and got a job at the Melrose Plastic Company making artificial flowers.
She had a beautiful personality. She always talked about her family, and she was in touch with her family, how much she loved New York, and her dream was to become an American citizen.
Shortly before she disappeared, Reina told Kathy that she was pregnant, but she did not tell her who the father was.
Is he going to marry you? She said, eventually he will marry me. I never asked who, because she never said who he was.
But Reina told Kathy that her boyfriend was married with 3 other children, and Reina was beginning to question whether he had any intention of leaving his wife and children to marry her.
So she got very angry. She called the house, and who answered the phone was his wife. And she told his wife that she was expecting a baby from her husband. Then he called her back, and he says, I am going to kill you. I will never forgive you. She was crying. She was terrified. She said, he's going to kill me. He's going to kill me. I said, why do you? She says, I don't know. I just made a stupid mistake.
When Kathy Andrade went to Reina's apartment, she found the door unlocked, but there was no sign of Reina.
And I waited for about 3 hours. When nobody returned, the phone never rang or anything, I got scared. I walked into the police station and I spoke to the officer. And he says, are you a relative of the young lady? I said, no, I'm only a friend. And I said, but she's pregnant, she's about to have a baby. Oh, she said, you know, she probably went shopping.
And since Kathy Andrade didn't know the identity of Reina's lover, there was little more she could tell police.
About Reina, honestly, I feel sorry, because there was a future for her. You know, she paid very dear for that mistake.
Mr. Elkins!
Investigators believe that Howard Elkins lured Reina to the factory one night shortly after she told Elkins' wife about their affair, and Elkins beat her to death. He then took the body to his suburban Long Island home, probably with the intention of dumping her into the ocean from his boat. He placed the body into a steel drum from work. Was to push it into a crawl space in his home, and there it remained undisturbed through numerous owners for 34 years.
And for 30 years, she spent in the barrel while Howard Elkins raised his family and had his children go to school and led whatever, as normal a life as you can, you know, waiting for that other shoe to drop.
And if trash collectors hadn't refused to pick up the drum, the secret of Howard Elkins and Reina Angelica Marroquin might never have been discovered. Oscar Corral covered the story for Newsday. He flew down to El Salvador to try to find Reina's family. In San Martin, a small village outside of San Salvador, he found Reina Marroquin's 95-year-old mother.
She came out to the front of the house where there's a porch, and I said to her, I'm a reporter from Newsday, New York. I told her that police had discovered a woman who had been murdered 30 years ago. And when she saw her daughter's picture, she almost fainted. She had to lean on somebody who was carrying her. Her face fell. She immediately began to weep. It had been 30 years that this woman waited for an answer. She told me she had dreams about her daughter for 30 years. She told me she had a dream even that her daughter was in a barrel that haunted her for so long.
Reina Marroquin left El Salvador because she discovered her husband had a lover who was pregnant with her husband's child. When she fled to New York City, Reina found herself in the same situation, although this time she was the pregnant other woman in a love triangle that had disastrous consequences.
So she was on both sides of the fence in this case, and in the end it cost her her life.
Investigators found one last message on a blank piece of paper found in the drum alongside Reina Marroquin and her unborn child. A message possibly from Reina herself to Howard Elkins. It said, "Don't be mad, I told the truth." In 1996, a suspicious house fire destroyed the home of a Seattle, Washington policeman. In a bizarre twist, an ex-convict confessed to setting the fire, then mysteriously disappeared. When investigators looked carefully at the written confession, they discovered clues of a more serious crime than arson. They found evidence of murder. Sergeant Matt Bachmeyer was a 25-year veteran of the King County Sheriff's Department, a man well-liked and respected by his peers.
This guy was a police hero. You know, he had been involved in several different types of shootouts or real interesting type of events and had survived them.
On July 9th, 1996, at 1:30 in the morning, a fire broke out in Sergeant Bachmeyer's suburban home. Bachmeyer was at a local bowling alley when the fire broke out. By the time the fire was extinguished, the home was almost completely destroyed. The origin of the fire appeared suspicious, and dogs specially trained to recognize flammable liquids or accelerants were sent to sniff through the rubble. The dogs identified 5 different areas where accelerants were used to set this fire. One was in the basement, a second in the dining room. There were 2 separate areas in the attic, and the 5th was in the garage. In arson terms, this is called a layering fire. On the outside wall of Sergeant Bachmeyer's garage were spray-painted messages critical of police. One said, "Rios lives." Guadalupe Rios was a man Sergeant Bachmeyer had shot and killed 8 years earlier in the line of duty. Bachmeyer told colleagues that he had received threats from Rios's friends and relatives, but until now, they had only been threats. Captain Dave Marin was Sergeant Bachmeyer's supervisor.
We were concerned anytime a fellow officer's home is arson, that's a traumatic event for them. And I talked to him about what he might need as a way of help and support and time off to recover from that.
While the arson investigation continued, Sergeant Bachmeyer himself uncovered some important information about the fire. It happened when he was called to break up a neighborhood fight.
Sir, you okay?
Yeah, I'm all right.
Can anybody here say what happened?
One of the men in that fight was Brad Wren, who had a history of mental problems and had some prior brushes with the law.
Thank you. What happened?
Well, I can start off by telling you, 2 weeks ago he was shot in the leg. And now tonight he got in a fight with his roommate's brother.
You doing okay? Is that leg all right?
It's certainly killing me, but I guess it's going to be all right.
All right, let's get down to the police station. You can take your statement there.
Sergeant Bachmeyer asked Wren to come to the police station so that he could take his statement. According to Sergeant Bachmeyer, during questioning, Wren asked Bachmeyer if he was the cop whose home was destroyed by the recent fire.
Are you the cop that had his house burned down?
Yeah, why?
When Bachmeyer said yes, Wren allegedly told Bachmeyer that he knew the identity of the arsonist.
It's a drug dealer I met in the bar. Pepe Hernandez.
Pepe Hernandez told Wren that a local cop had stolen some drugs and money from him during a recent drug bust.
Hey man, this cop busted me the other day.
Yeah?
He stole my dope and my stash of money.
So what are you gonna do?
I know where he lives, and I wanna go get my stuff back. You know, I'll give you $500 if you come and help me.
The cop Hernandez was talking about was none other than Sergeant Bachmeyer.
So I said, okay.
Then what happened?
We broke in your house. Pepe tore the house up. We couldn't find the drugs or the money. So Pepe started stealing things. Paintings and statues. And I heard him say he was gonna burn your house down. Then he just did it.
Where is he now?
If you think I'm gonna help you find him, you're crazy. He'll kill me. When I left, he was pissed, and I'm glad he's gone.
Sergeant Bachmeyer transcribed Wren's entire statement, had Wren sign it, then released him from custody. But Bachmeyer had a dilemma. The confession implicated him in the theft of drugs and money. So he decided not to turn it over to his superiors, at least not yet. Brad Wren The man who allegedly confessed to taking part in the arson of Sergeant Matt Bachmeier's home had a history of mental problems. It all started when Brad Wren was in the Air Force. He was in a severe motorcycle accident and barely escaped with his life.
He had massive brain injuries. They didn't know if he went in a coma. They didn't know what to tell us or anything till he come out of the coma.
Wren eventually recovered, but he was never the same after the accident. His personality changed. He was more aggressive, and for the first time in his life, got into trouble with the law. Shortly after the accident, he was convicted of a sex-related offense and spent 3 months in prison. More recently, Wren was in a violent argument with his roommate, Emmett Marcel, who shot him in the leg, shattering his tibia.
His roommate had a mental problem too, and if he didn't take his medication, why, then he was just more or less wacky, you know. And evidently he'd been off his medication for a while, and him and Brad got into it.
They were doing some kind of siding or roofing or something for a friend. And Brad hit Emmett's finger with the hammer. And that's what Emmett said he shot him for.
Unaware of Brad Wren's alleged confession, arson investigator Becky Gibbs was assigned to investigate the arson fire of Sergeant Bachmeier's home. She saw evidence that was inconsistent with a fire set for revenge.
And typically, if somebody's going to set a fire for revenge, they may go to some trouble to set a fire, but this particular way of setting a fire takes some time.
The debris from the fire was analyzed using gas chromatography, which found traces of gasoline in the debris. There was also evidence that road flares were used to ignite the gasoline.
These would be considered a time delay device. If you set the road flare on fire, the fire doesn't start right away, but once it reaches the point where it's touching the gas container, then the gas container would melt and the fire would start.
Most fires set for revenge do not use time delay devices. The flares would have given Sergeant Bachmeier enough time to drive to the bowling alley to establish his alibi before the gasoline containers exploded. Investigators were also suspicious because Bachmeier's artwork, porcelain collection, and bowling trophies were found undamaged in his backyard shed after the fire. Sergeant Bachmeier became the prime suspect. He adamantly denied any involvement, but when asked to take a lie detector test, he refused. Under increasing scrutiny, Sergeant Bachmeier had no choice but to produce Brad Wren's alleged confession, even though it implicated Bachmeier in stealing from a reputed drug dealer. When police tried to interview Brad Wren to corroborate his confession, they discovered he was missing.
There wasn't any of his clothes, none of his shoes, nothing left in the house.
I knew Brad was dead. I knew it. I don't know how I knew it. I knew my son was dead. We would have heard from him. He would have never went off and left his dogs with nobody taking care of them. He would have never, he would have just never left them like that.
Detective Denny Gula asked Matt Bachmeier if he knew anything about Wren's disappearance, since Bachmeier was the last known person to see Wren alive.
He starts laughing. He goes, well, if you find him dead with my business card nailed to his forehead, you'll know who to come talk to. And he kind of laughs it off kind of jokingly. And, you know, I wrote that down when he says it because I'm going, that's kind of bizarre.
Police could find no arrest record for anyone by the name of Pepe Hernandez, and police officials say Bachmeier's handling of Brad Wren's interrogation was improper.
It would be highly, highly unusual for a experienced police sergeant of 25 years to take a statement like that alone from a suspect. And then certainly to release him immediately afterwards would be extremely, extremely rare.
Although Brad Wren's family identified the signature on the bottom of the alleged confession as Brad's, forensic document examiners weren't entirely convinced. In Seattle, Washington, police were conducting two simultaneous investigations. One into the fire that destroyed Police Sergeant Matt Bachmeier's home. The other, a search for the whereabouts of Brad Wren. They were connected, since Brad Wren was last seen alive in the back seat of Sergeant Bachmeier's patrol car.
That was the last sighting we had, and in police investigations, the last person seen with someone who's alive is certainly going to attract your interest.
The 4.5-page statement in which Brad Wren allegedly admitted to taking part in the arson of Sergeant Bachmeier's home was written by Bachmeier, then signed by Wren, which is standard procedure. Brad Wren had signed the first 4 pages of the confession, but for some unexplained reason did not sign the last page.
In our department, that's not normal. That's not a normal procedure. We would write the whole statement, and the very last page would have that on it.
The confession was subjected to a process known as video spectrography. To the naked eye, the ink in Wren's confession all looked the same. But the video spectrography told a different story. Under various infrared light sources, scientists could see that the confession was written with 3 different inks. All of Wren's signatures and his initials were written in a black ink with high luminescence. The entire first page and the top of the second used a gray-black ink with medium luminescence. From then on, a third ink was used, a black ink that shows no reaction to the infrared light. And there were other discrepancies. Wren's occupation was listed as truck driver, which was incorrect, as was other vital information.
James Wren's birth date was different. On the second page, it's listed as 1971, and then on the third and fourth page, it's 1961, and then the fifth page doesn't even have a birth date.
In the confession, Bachmeier incorrectly wrote the contraction for UR as YOUR. The same mistake found in the threatening message on Sergeant Bachmeier's garage after the fire. Next, scientists checked Bachmeier's patrol car and found something unusual.
As they go through the back seat of Bachmeier's patrol car, they find just very faint traces of blood. And initially they thought, well, it's a police car. It's not going to be unusual to have faint traces of blood in the back seat of a police car. They open up the seat and they find in the stitching several bloodstain patterns on the backside of the seat cover that had soaked through the stitching.
Using a sample of blood from Brad Wren's parents, a reverse paternity DNA test was made. It proved conclusively that the blood from the back seat of the patrol car was that of Brad Wren.
Can anybody here tell me what happened?
Bachmeier said the blood was from Wren's bloody nose that occurred in the fight Bachmeier was called to break up. Investigators decided to test this hypothesis to see if the size of the bloodstain was consistent with a nosebleed. Forensic scientists used identical rear seats from other patrol cars to conduct their test. Using head sculptures with wigs and weights to simulate a human head, investigators poured different amounts of blood onto the seat cushions. It took 2 quarts of blood to produce a stain the size found in Bachmeier's patrol car. A loss of 2 quarts of blood would be life-threatening. Police also found Brad Wren's blood on a pair of Sergeant Bachmeier's work shoes. Investigators now believed that Brad Wren died in the back seat of Sergeant Bachmeier's patrol car. But where was Brad Wren's body? 7 months after Brad Wren's disappearance, hikers in a restricted area of Cougar Mountain Park outside of Seattle found some bones and what appeared to be a human skull. The bones had been scattered by animals. Fragments were found over a quarter mile away. Only 20% of the skeleton was recovered, but the size and shape of the cranium told forensic anthropologists that the victim was male and that the condition of the bones indicated they had been in the park less than a year. They also found a steel rod in the lower leg bone, a surgical repair identical to one performed on Brad Wren. And near some of the bones in the park, searchers found a red, white, and blue leg cast. Witnesses said Brad Wren was wearing an identical leg cast when he left with Sergeant Bachmeyer in his patrol car. The marrow in one of the bones was tested for DNA, and the results confirmed what investigators already suspected. The bone was that of Brad Wren.
First thing I did, start bawling. Cried my heart out. But I was glad in a lot of ways they found him. It was hell, not knowing where he was at.
The only remaining question for investigators was the motive.
The story is so convoluted and so sort of pathetically obvious in its fabrication that it almost defies belief. I mean, I think it would be rejected as a plot for a novel or a script for a movie because it just seems so absurd and outlandish and unnecessarily sort of complex and contradictory.
Matt Bachmeyer was an avid bowler, and his dream was to compete on the Professional Bowlers Tour. Prosecutors believe Bachmeyer set fire to his own home using the time delay device, giving him time to get to the bowling alley to establish his alibi. Bachmeyer may have planned to use the insurance money from the fire to finance his entry onto the Pro Bowlers Tour. But removing his bowling trophies and artwork from the home before the fire was a classic arson mistake. When Bachmeyer learned he was a suspect in the arson, he looked for a scapegoat. Brad Wren was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and there is no evidence he ever made it to police headquarters for questioning. Somewhere along the way, Bachmeyer stopped his car and forced or coerced Wren into signing some blank police reports.
I'm not going to bother taking you down to the station. I'll just write the report from what you've already told me. There'd be no charges. Just sign a couple of these forms for me, would you?
Is this something you normally do?
Yeah. It's fine. Hey, do me a favor. In case your statement goes on too long, could you sign a few extra copies for me?
Yeah, sure.
Then, Bachmeyer murdered him. Wren's blood seeped into the rear seat cushions as Bachmeyer made the 30-minute drive to Cougar Mountain Park to dump the body. Sometime later, Bachmeyer composed the phony confession, which forensic technology revealed as bogus.
I'd never been so mad at somebody in my whole life. There was a time or two there that I just wanted to get hold of him so bad. I think I could have ripped him limb by limb. I was just furious with that man.
I don't think he's much of a man. I think the man must have a mental problem or something. I don't know. I can't feature a police officer 25 years or so doing something like this without having some kind of a problem. What was he going to gain out of it, you know? I don't know.
Sergeant Matt Bachmeyer was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. Seattle prosecutors say It was one of the most bizarre murder cases they had ever encountered.
I can't pretend to tell you what sort of a person gets drawn into a web of his own making to the extent that he's willing to take a human life. All I can say is that we see this happen, and we rarely see it happen with a law enforcement officer with 25 years of service. But most murders are fundamentally inexplicable, unreasonable, irrational events.
I think stupid would apply, but I think the thing that comes to mind is just really underestimated the people that worked around him.
One of our members was talking not too long ago about someone writing a book about this, and they said, I don't think anybody will write a book about this because when you tell the story, it's not believable. But it is interesting. And so I think this still, for quite some time to come, will be with our department, unfortunately.
In 1987, a mother and her 2 young daughters were brutally murdered in their apartment in Anchorage, Alaska. Microscopic clues from inside the apartment identified a family relative as a possible suspect. But how could investigators tell whether the evidence was fresh or had been there since long before the murders? Anchorage, Alaska is considered one of the most scenic cities in the United States. Bordered by the Alaska Mountain Range on one side and the Pacific Ocean on the other, it draws tens of thousands of tourists each year. The lifeblood of the state had been the oil business. But in the mid-1980s, prices for crude oil crashed, forcing thousands of workers off the job. John Newman was one of the oil workers who lost his job. When he couldn't find other work in Alaska, he left for California to take classes to become a locksmith. His wife, Nancy, stayed behind to care for their 2 young daughters, 8-year-old Melissa and 3-year-old Angie.
Angie was a cherub, beautiful blonde hair, just cute, charming, very charming. Melissa was at that stage where she wasn't baby cute anymore, but she had all the potential to be beautiful.
Nancy worked as a waitress at Gwenny's restaurant, an Anchorage landmark. She was known for never missing a day. And when she didn't come to work one Sunday morning, her co-workers were concerned.
Nancy's sister Cheryl worked for us as a hostess, and they were very, very close. And I said, Cheryl, you know, you got your car, can you run over and check on Nancy, see what's going on?
Cheryl immediately drove over to her sister's apartment. Nancy Newman's front door was locked, but inside was a scene of horrific violence. Nancy was found in her bedroom. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death with a pillowcase. 8-year-old Melissa had met the same fate. 3-year-old Angie had bled to death after her throat was slashed.
We'd never had a crime like that in town before. You know, a whole family basically killed, and in their own house. That was very heinous and definitely out of the ordinary for Anchorage.
The coroner estimated the murders took place sometime on Saturday morning. None of the neighbors saw or heard anything unusual during that time. Although there were no signs of forced entry, Nancy Newman's camera and purse were missing from the apartment. A knife was also missing from a butcher block in the kitchen. A cookie tin that normally held Nancy's waitressing tips was empty on the kitchen table. A damp wash rag was found in the bathroom sink.
He was in a comfort zone inside that apartment. He knew this situation of these victims enough to know that he wouldn't, in all likelihood, be interrupted, that he could spend a significant amount of time, and we could tell he spent a significant amount of time. He had 3 different victims, 3 different bedrooms, 2 of them sexually assaulted. And then we had the person completely cleaning up. He had to be covered in blood.
John Newman was attending school in California. Police could find no evidence that he had returned to Alaska at the time of the murders and was not considered a suspect. But the killings reflected a great rage on the part of the perpetrator. Police wondered if Nancy Newman had made an enemy among co-workers or customers of the restaurant.
It was a difficult station that she worked. It was normally, you know, single guys, and maybe they were hungover, maybe they were just being jerks.
As John Newman returned home to bury his wife and 2 small children, investigators wondered whether this was a botched robbery attempt that had turned violent or an act of revenge. After the murders of Nancy Newman and her 2 daughters, Melissa and Angie, Anchorage residents feared that a random sex killer was on the loose.
Why didn't somebody hear Nancy's screams? I used to have dreams at night. I'd hear a woman screaming. And it would be, you know, when you first fall asleep, and I'd wake up and I'd still hear the screams. But I didn't know what to do. Couldn't do anything. And for a while, I didn't know if it was dreams or if it was really happening.
Who in this community would commit such a crime where they would actually kill 2 young children like that? And if it wasn't the husband, then who? And was he still out there on the streets? And that had a lot of people who were genuinely scared.
The lack of forced entry and the time spent in the apartment led investigators to believe the killer had been there before.
Yeah, this is the worst case that I've worked. I've been involved in one form or another over 200 homicide investigations, and this would be the worst as far as the victims go. The brutality, the age, what was done to them.
At the crime scene, investigators searched for fingerprints using a technique called super glue fuming. When super glue is heated, the fumes attach to the biological material in finger oils. Then powder is used to reveal the print.
Sometimes you'll be able to see them, sometimes you will not after the superglue fuming process is completed. As a fingerprint examiner, once those fingerprints are fixed, we'll either photograph them as they develop or add different chemicals to that item to try to make the fingerprints visible so that we can preserve them and compare them to suspects or other individuals.
Kathy Monfrida found over 100 fingerprints in the apartment. Many did not belong to anyone in the immediate family. These prints were found on the inside of the front door, on the cookie tin, where Nancy Newman kept her waitressing tips, in the bathroom, and in other areas. Investigators identified the prints as those of Kirby Anthony, a nephew of the Newman family. Anthony was a 23-year-old drifter who had recently moved to Anchorage from Idaho. Since he needed a place to stay, the Newmans allowed him to move in temporarily.
Kirby had lived there with them. They had let him stay there. He was a relative. They felt sorry for him. They knew he'd had a troubled past. And so he had a legitimate reason for being in there, which means a lot to what we're going to discover and trace evidence.
They put him up, he stayed with them. He got it, and I think they got along okay, although we did hear later and learn that he didn't get along real well with Melissa, the 8-year-old.
Kirby Anthony admitted that living in a small apartment with 2 young children was difficult, and he told police he moved out amicably just 2 weeks before the murders. Furthermore, Kirby Anthony denied any knowledge of the attack and said he had an alibi. He told police he was out with friends on Friday night and spent Saturday morning eating breakfast at a Burger King restaurant. In addition to the fingerprints, investigators found large amounts of hair in almost every room of the Newmans' apartment. The hairs were Caucasian and were not similar to anyone in the Newman family. Anchorage police sent the hairs to the FBI in Washington, D.C., hoping that they could shed some light on the identity of the killer. At FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., analyst Doug Diedrich examined all of the hairs and fibers collected from the Newmans' apartment. There were thousands of hairs and fibers throughout the apartment, which is not unusual. But Diedrich found large numbers of hairs in the victims' bedrooms, which were pubic.
It is very easy to distinguish the differences between a head hair and a pubic hair. Differences being in diameter, length, color, internal microscopic characteristics, the appearance of the tip. Pubic hairs generally have a pointed tip, whereas head hairs are often cut.
His first task was to compare the hairs to the victims and to their prime suspect, Kirby Anthony. In Diedrich's opinion, the pubic hairs were microscopically similar to hair samples collected from Kirby Anthony. But Anthony's hairs in the apartment could be explained since he had been living there until 10 days before the murders. The question was, when were these hairs left in the apartment? To find out, Doug Diedrich devised a unique experiment.
I had to take a vacuum home. I had to vacuum the house. I don't believe the house has ever been any cleaner. But every night for 2 weeks, I vacuumed and then compared afterwards to see what types of hairs I found and how many hairs I found.
Diedrich discovered that pubic hairs can travel or migrate from room to room. And the way that happens in a household is through what is called a secondary transfer. Pubic hairs travel from room to room, primarily on socks. The Diedrich experiment revealed that these transfers were limited. Very few pubic hairs from an adult's bedroom migrate into a child's bedroom. How then to account for the large number of Kirby Anthony's pubic hairs in the children's rooms? One explanation was that Anthony was in the girl's bedroom nude or uncovered. In addition, all of the pubic hairs found in these rooms were clean and moist. If the hairs had been there since the time Anthony was living there, the shafts would have been dry and collected dirt.
When a hair is deposited, especially on the floor, in the carpet of a residence, over time the hair can exhibit chew marks from beetle larvae that tend to eat on the hairs. The hairs will accumulate dirt or debris on the surface. The hairs that were found on the body of Melissa and on Angie, all 3 of those hairs, pubic hairs, like Kirby Anthony's, did not have any dirt on them. Actually, it would look like fresh blood on the surface of the hairs. And that, I thought, was very significant.
Next, Diedrich examined the damp wash rag found in the Newman sink after the murders. On the wash rag were some green wool fibers which matched a pair of gloves found in Nancy Newman's bedroom. Also on the wash rag were traces of the victim's blood. Finally, Dietrich made a startling discovery. On the wash rag were pubic hairs with partial egg casings from pubic lice, an extremely rare finding. The hairs were microscopically similar to Kirby Anthony, and investigators discovered that Anthony had recently been treated for pubic lice. And there was more evidence linking Kirby Anthony to the Newman crime scene. One was the location of Kirby Anthony's palm print in a particularly unusual location.
Above Melissa's bed, on the wall, an entire left handprint was developed.
Melissa had been sexually assaulted. The print, only 10 inches above her head, was telling. Anthony's fingerprints were also found on the container that Nancy Newman used to hold the cash tips from the restaurant. Kirby Anthony's roommate told police that on the morning of the murders, Anthony had walked into their apartment with blood on his clothing and immediately washed everything he was wearing. The roommate also revealed that Anthony was counting a large amount of change later that same day. Police were still missing two important pieces of evidence: the murder weapon and a motive. As the investigation into the murders of Nancy Newman and her two daughters continued, more and more evidence pointed to the Newmans' nephew, Kirby Anthony. When the Anchorage police searched for a motive, they learned that Kirby Anthony's departure from the Newman apartment was not as amicable as he first admitted.
John, Kirby is making me very uncomfortable. Now he's...
John Newman told police that his wife had called him in California. She said Anthony was behaving inappropriately and on at least one occasion had struck the children.
Kirby was acting inappropriate. He was starting to physically discipline the girls, get angry at them. It was very uncomfortable for Nancy and the girls, and Nancy had relayed this information to John. And John had told Nancy to tell him to leave, get him out of the apartment.
Police believe that it was an angry Kirby Anthony who moved into this dilapidated apartment just 10 days before the murders. Investigators had one last piece of physical evidence to examine: the vacuum cleaner Nancy Newman used to clean her apartment. A neighbor told police Nancy Newman vacuumed her apartment shortly before the murders.
I wouldn't call her exactly a clean freak, not obsessively clean freak, but for somebody with two little kids, and I had two little kids, it was a very neat, well-ordered place.
When Doug Dietrich looked inside the vacuum cleaner bag, he saw many separate layers of dirt. Each layer was different. The top layer was the most recent layer of dirt. In it, Dietrich could find only one pubic hair from Kirby Anthony. The absence of Kirby Anthony's pubic hairs in the top layer of dirt in the vacuum bag, along with the presence of a great deal of his pubic hair at the murder scene, indicated that Kirby Anthony had been inside the apartment between the time it was last vacuumed and the time of the murders.
If I saw Kirby today, I'd shoot him. Run over him with a car. Just whatever. And you know, that would ruin my life. This man has scarred so many people. What he did to Nancy and the girls was unthinkable.
Prosecutors believe that the microscopic trail of evidence Kirby Anthony left behind clearly shows his path on the morning of the murders. The theory was that Anthony was angry after he was forced to vacate the Newmans' apartment and sought revenge. The night before the murders, friends said Kirby was using cocaine and alcohol. The next morning, Anthony entered the Newmans' apartment. The children were sent to their rooms.
John and I asked you to leave. You shouldn't even be here. You're not welcome.
At some point, Anthony grabbed a kitchen knife and forced Nancy Newman into her bedroom. Wearing wool gloves he found in the bedroom, he raped and strangled Nancy Newman with a pillowcase. Then he entered Melissa's bedroom, assaulting and killing her too, leaving his palm print above her bed. The evidence suggests Anthony cleaned himself in the bathroom, leaving the damp washcloth complete with his pubic hair lice, the green wool fibers, and the victim's blood in the sink. He then killed 3-year-old Angie, the only remaining person who could place him at the scene. Anthony left his fingerprints on the cookie tin as he took Nancy's tips. He also took Nancy's purse, camera, and the knife he used in the murders. The purse and the knife were never recovered. The camera was later found in his possession.
It's a crime of opportunity. Kirby was a very disorganized killer. He just walked over there for whatever reason, became out of control, and continued down this path of destruction.
At the trial, Kirby Anthony pleaded not guilty and acted as his own lawyer. His defense was that he was framed by police, but he had no explanation for the washcloth and the wealth of evidence it contained.
The courtroom was packed pretty much every day. While they were waiting for the judge to come into the chambers, Kirby Anthony turned and looked over at John Newman, who was in the gallery there, and he said, "You're a fool, John." And I can remember our cameras capturing John's reaction. He was crying, he was in tears, he was so angry.
I would say the stupidest thing that Kirby Anthony did was have himself declared co-counsel and try and represent himself. And the other stupidest thing is actually get on the witness stand. I'd say the other stupidest thing he did was he turned around to John Newman in the court when it was filled with people and called him a fool.
After 2 hours of deliberation, Kirby Anthony was found guilty and sentenced to 357 years in prison. Detective Mike Grimes has difficulty forgetting the unspeakable violence that took the lives of a loving mother and her 2 young children.
We can scenario this and try and figure out why people do things. You never can get inside their head. There was a sexual motivation there. I have theories that the reason he was asked to move out, I think something happened between him and one of the little girls. I think he was very resentful of it. Kirby was a drug abuser, particularly cocaine. And I think knowing his psychopathic personality fueled by cocaine, I think he went over there in a rage.
Nancy Newman's camera, the one found in Kirby Anthony's possession after the murders, contained family photos taken during happier times. Pictures of the lives destroyed by a senseless act of revenge. In 1982, An 11-year-old girl was abducted in broad daylight from this softball field in Marshallville, Ohio. When her badly decomposed body was found 1 week later, investigators hoped that the orange triangular-shaped fibers found at the scene would lead them to the killer. Marshallville, Ohio, is a small agricultural community with a population of just under 750. It's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody else, where people care about each other. Krista Lee Harrison was a carefree 11-year-old girl growing up in a place most residents thought was exempt from big city crime.
Krista Harrison was always around the town. When we were at the ballpark playing softball, her brother and I on the local softball team, Krista was always near the home plate area there when we were coming in and off the field, always joking around with us.
On July 17, 1982, Krista and a friend, a boy who lived nearby, were collecting aluminum cans at the softball field, which was directly across the street from Krista's home. When the boy went to get a drink, a van drove up and stopped next to Krista. The boy told authorities the man forced Krista into his van and took off.
I had been on the force for 10 years at the time this happened, and I had never seen anything like this. I can't even tell you the last time we experienced anything, abduction like this of a young child. So it was very emotional for all of us.
Within hours, police set up roadblocks and issued an all-points bulletin for the van, which was described as dark red or brown with bubble-shaped rear side windows. Krista's friend described the abductor as a white male aged 25 to 35 with dark curly hair and a mustache. Volunteers searched the entire area immediately following the abduction, on the ground, in the air, and also in the local waterways, all without success.
We were anticipating maybe a ransom telephone call to the parents, so we had made arrangements to record phone calls. We had set up separate phone lines for them to use so they wouldn't have to tie up their telephone, hopefully waiting to get this ransom call, which never came.
6 days later, in a deserted field just outside of town, hunters found the badly decomposed remains of a young girl. The body was partially wrapped in a clear plastic bag. Near the body, investigators found a pair of men's blue jeans, a plaid shirt, and a pair of black leather gloves. A few miles away, searchers found a clump of human hair, a beach towel, and a cardboard box covered with blood. Forensic tests confirmed that the body was that of Krista Harrison.
Mr. Harrison, Gerald, was there a little after I had arrived, and we told Gerald, after I could not identify her. She was just so decomposed, and I told Gerald, I said, just, remember Krista the way she was.
The autopsy revealed Krista had died of strangulation. She had also been sexually assaulted. In Krista's hair, clothing, and on the beach towel found near the body, forensic scientists noticed some unusual orange fibers.
I saw fibers, several fibers that really stood out. They were an ugly orange fiber.
Forensic scientist Jeffrey Lynn had seen these same orange fibers before, just 8 months earlier. Similar fibers were found on the body of 12-year-old Tina Harmon, who had been raped and murdered in a nearby town.
It was amazing to me that I saw the same fibers on Krista Harrison that I had seen on Tina Harmon's. Tina Harmon's were so unusual, and there were so many of them. We really thought they were important, or I really thought those were important at that time. But when I saw them on Krista Harrison, then I knew we had something very important.
But there was a problem. The man convicted of Harmon's murder, Herman Ray Rucker, was in police custody at the time of Krista Harrison's murder. Rucker was serving a life sentence for that crime. The evidence against Rucker had been largely circumstantial, since investigators had not been able to link Rucker to the distinctive orange fibers. Investigators now wondered whether the wrong man had been convicted of Tina Harmon's murder. If so, a serial murderer was on the loose in the farmlands of Ohio. When Krista Harrison's body was discovered in a field 30 miles from her home in Marshallville, Ohio, investigators had only 2 clues to the perpetrator's identity. First, a witness said the abductor was driving a brown van with bubble-shaped side rear windows. Second, there were a number of unusual orange fibers in Krista Harrison's hair and on the beach towel found near her body. In the forensics lab, scientists discovered that the fibers were man-made, specifically polyester. Under the microscope, the fibers were triangular in shape, or trilobal.
The fact that it was polyester and trilobal indicated to me, even back before we had a suspect, that it was likely a carpet fiber.
Forensic scientist Jeffrey Lynn was concerned since he found the same orange fibers on another victim, 12-year-old Tina Harmon, who was raped and murdered 8 months earlier. A migrant farm worker, Herman Ray Rucker, had already been convicted of Tina Harmon's murder and was serving a life sentence in prison.
They were too unusual to be seen on the bodies of 2 girls, both abducted, both sexually assaulted, both murdered in Wayne County.
Investigators realized that the possibility of Krista Harrison and Tina Harmon both coming into contact with orange trilobal carpet fibers at the hands of 2 different killers was extremely unlikely.
Some quick test between the 2 fibers showed that they compared and that they were the same. Now people were very nervous because we had, in the minds of the community, 2 girls taken from our village streets, and it appeared to be the same person.
Investigators turned their attention to the clear plastic bag found wrapped around Krista Harrison's ankles. It was unusual because of its thickness and the unique way the bag had been folded in the manufacturing process. FBI Special Agent Bill Callis needed to find the origin of that plastic bag. He traced it to a manufacturer in Pioneer, Ohio. The bag found with Krista Harrison was the same thickness, size, and shape, and had the same fold patterns as those manufactured for a line of black leather custom seats for use in vans. The seats were sold exclusively through a specialty mail-order catalog for Sears, Roebuck & Company. The cardboard box used to transport Krista Harrison's body was unusual, since it was L-shaped and was positively identified as the shipping container for these same black leather van seats. The next step was to search Sears records to identify all Ohio residents who had purchased these black leather seats in the months preceding Krista's abduction.
The next order of business was, of course, to go to those people and interview them to determine whether or not they might be a potential suspect in our case.
There were only 23 people in northern Ohio who ordered these leather van seats, but none owned a red, maroon, or brown van with teardrop-shaped bubble windows on the back side panel that were clearly described by the witness. The killer with the orange carpet was still on the loose.
This guy is obviously out there. We haven't got him yet. He's done this before, and he's certainly likely to do it again. So there was a real urgency to finding this individual.
The town of Marshallville, Ohio mourned the death of Krista Lee Harrison and life went on, although no one felt the same sense of security they once did. Weeks passed, then months. Then the one-year anniversary of Krista's murder, still with no arrests. To the disappointment of investigators working the case, it appeared that the trail of the bright orange fibers had turned cold.
People became very aware of the safety of their children. They locked the doors at night. The kids weren't out of eyesight of a trusted neighbor, their parents, etc. People did watch their kids a lot closer. The park became a ghost town. Children didn't play out there for a while. And it was a tremendous apprehension that this could happen again.
Investigators wondered whether Krista Harrison's killer would strike again, and if so, where? Krista Harrison's killer left behind a trail of physical evidence. Investigators knew he ordered black leather van seats from a Sears mail order catalog because the plastic covering and carton from that purchase were found with Krista Harrison's body. They also knew that the killer had orange trilobal-shaped carpet in his van or home. All they needed now was a suspect.
The fibers were something that were left behind by the criminal, but we didn't have the second part of the equation. We needed to match those fibers with fibers in the possession of a suspect or a criminal.
It took police an entire year before they finally got the break they needed, and they got it from a most unlikely source. 50 miles from where Krista Harrison was abducted, the manager of a local gas station, a woman we'll call Debbie, was doing some maintenance work outside when she was abducted at gunpoint.
Don't move. Come with me.
She was driven to an unknown location, and over the next several hours, her head was shaved. She was beaten, assaulted, and tortured with electricity.
It was sadistic, inhuman, and no one should be out on the street after they have done what they did to me, and I was 28 at the time.
The man tortured her by taking a lamp cord and cutting the wire and plugging it in and then using the 2 electric leads.
I was tortured repeatedly. It was the blood that was everywhere. It was on the ceiling, but it was in a hallway, on a bench is how I was tortured, with 4 limbs tied.
The next morning, Debbie's attacker left her handcuffed and chained to the bed.
If you try to escape, I'll kill you. I'm going out. I won't be long.
After 12 hours of captivity, still bleeding from her wounds, Debbie's enormous will to survive took over.
I even thought at one point I'd have to eat my thumbs if I could. I mean, I was so desperate to get out because I knew he was going to kill me.
Eventually, Debbie freed one of her hands from the ropes and then was able to free her ankles. This left the excruciatingly painful process of attempting to pull her remaining hand through the metal frame of the handcuff. Miraculously, she succeeded. She grabbed a bathrobe and fled. Once outside, Debbie had no idea where she was, so she turned to the only place she could think of for help.
And I looked up to God and I said, God, I need a sign. I need help. I don't know where I'm at. And a poodle barked. So I went to that house, and she was a wonderful, wonderful lady, Mrs. Smith.
Mrs. Smith immediately phoned the police.
She was so badly bruised, it looked like deep purple underwear that she was wearing.
It was God's will. I'm a miracle as far as escaping. It was a miracle.
Debbie identified the man who had kidnapped her as Robert Anthony Buell. Buell worked for the city of Akron, Ohio in the planning department, was college educated, dating a local attorney, and was a respected member of the community. Faced with the evidence against him, Buell pleaded no contest to the charge of kidnapping and rape. But police couldn't help but notice that Buell was driving a brown van similar to the one seen at Krista Harrison's abduction. Although it did not have the same bubble-shaped windows in the back the witness clearly described, Buell's van did have an orange carpet in the back. Robert Buell denied he was involved in Krista Harrison's abduction. Buell's attorney pointed out that even if the carpet in the back of Buell's van was similar to the carpet fibers found on Krista Harrison, they were not unique, since many other Ohio residents had similar carpet in their home, office, or automobiles.
And even though this polyester trilobal ugly orange color was pretty unique, certainly there are millions of other fibers like it in the world. This is not like a fingerprint comparison. This is not like a DNA comparison. This is not a definitive match.
What else would prosecutors find out about these unusual orange fibers? Would there be another link to sew up the case? A year after the murder of 11-year-old Krista Harrison, police finally had a suspect in 43-year-old Robert Buell, an employee of the city of Akron, Ohio. He had been arrested for the kidnapping and rape of a gas station manager who escaped after 12 grueling hours of torture. And in a surprise discovery in the back of Buell's van, investigators found orange polyester trilobal carpet similar to the fibers found on Krista Harrison's body.
We now had the second part of the equation. We had the fibers from Krista's hair, we had the fibers from Krista's clothing, we had the fibers from the Budweiser blanket, and we now had something to compare it to, the fibers from the van.
To see how rare or common this carpet was, investigators tracked the manufacturer of the carpet to the J.P. Stevens Company in Canton, Ohio. Factory records indicated that this particular carpet was not a big seller because of its color.
They had only ever manufactured 12,000 square yards of this carpeting. Their records also showed that of that 12,000 square yards, only 74 square yards was ever shipped to Northern Ohio.
Further investigation revealed that Robert Buell had purchased 2 black leather van seats from Sears and Roebuck on June 30th, just 3 weeks before Krista's murder. The plastic bag which covered those seats, along with the cardboard shipping box, were both found with Krista Harrison's body. Robert Buell also owned a van similar to the one at Krista Harrison's abduction. It was similar but not identical, since Buell's van did not have the teardrop-shaped bubble windows the witness described. However, neighbors told police that Buell had removed the bubble-shaped side windows and installed sliding rectangular ones shortly after Krista Harrison's murder. Inside Robert Buell's home was even more evidence linking him to Krista Harrison's murder. Police discovered Robert Buell owned a pair of jeans identical in size, make, and with the same wear patterns as the discarded jeans found near Krista Harrison's body. Tiny specks of beige and blue paint, also found on the discarded jeans, matched the beige and blue paint samples on the walls of Robert Buell's home. Black spray paint from Buell's garage was found on the cardboard box found near Krista's body. Prosecutors believe that Buell took Krista Harrison to his home immediately following the abduction. The orange carpet fibers from the van were later found in Krista Harrison's hair. After the murder, Buell placed Krista's body in the plastic bag from one of his new van seats, then placed the body inside the cardboard shipping box that held those seats. Buell dumped the body 30 miles outside of town in a field. A little further away, Buell discarded the jeans and shirt he had been wearing. Tests on the bones indicated the body had been in extremely high temperatures for quite some time, an indication the body was in the vehicle for days before it was dumped in the field. Robert Buell never realized that the unusual orange carpet fibers from his van, along with the ability to track the plastic bag and the cardboard box, would be his undoing. On April 4th, 1984, a jury found Robert Anthony Buell guilty of the kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder of 11-year-old Krista Lee Harrison and sentenced him to death in the electric chair. Herman Ray Rucker, the man convicted of Tina Harmon's murder, won a new trial since the same orange trilobal carpet fibers were discovered at that crime scene. Rucker was later acquitted. Prosecutors believe that Robert Buell may have been involved in Tina Harmon's murder. Robert Buell denies this, and no charges have been filed. Investigators agree that if it hadn't been for Debbie's courage, perseverance, and will to survive, Robert Buell might never have been apprehended.
I have to believe that Krista's watching us, all of us. And maybe she was the angel that helped me, you know? God could have gave her wings and she could have helped me escape too, you know? And I'm sure she knows, you know, where Buell is, so that, you know, he can't hurt another person, another child, ever.
I knew that when I first saw the fibers on the victim, they had a potential to be very important. And they turned out to be a very definitive link between this individual and Krista Harrison.
This case was built on scientific evidence, and the fiber evidence was the scientific evidence that allowed the jury to find Buell guilty of killing Krista Harrison and impose the death penalty for that crime.
In the backwoods of Georgia, in a dilapidated house, a 49-year-old recluse named Virginia Ridley was found dead. A medical examiner ruled the death a homicide. But who would murder someone who seldom ventured out of her home? Investigators found some clues in the note she had written shortly before her death. Ringgold, Georgia, is a small rural town located at the base of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Life is simple here. The main street has only 3 traffic lights, and most of the town's 750 residents know or do business with each other. Alvin Ridley was a well-known figure in Ringgold. At one time, he ran the town's only television repair shop. In 1966, he married 18-year-old Virginia Hickey, and almost immediately, Virginia cut off all contact with her family. Alvin said it was because her family was too intrusive. Virginia's sister, Trixie LaCroix, says Alvin forced Virginia to stay away from her family.
I sent them an invitation to every wedding, every death, every birthing in our family. To no avail. Nothing was ever acknowledged, nothing. my father's death. My father went to his grave after making every effort possible to try to see his daughter, never having seen her after she got, mixed up with Mr. Ridley.
Alvin Ridley had a reputation in Ringgold, and it wasn't a particularly good one. He was known for filing lawsuits against anyone he felt had wronged him, and in the process, he had made a lot of enemies.
He's always accusing. He's very suspicious. He trusts no one, really. And so that obviously put him at odds with a lot of people, city, government, on licensing issues. The city chief of police, of course, the county sheriff.
In 1984, after a minor traffic accident, he filed a series of legal actions and got hit with a countersuit. He lost and had to forfeit his van as payment.
July of 1984, they seized my van without due process of law, without a fair hearing, and it somewhere in there it turned all my customers, friends, suppliers, dealers, creditors against me, and they wouldn't sell me no more products, so it forced me out of business.
The loss of his van meant the failure of his television repair business, which started a further downward spiral. He was known as Crazy Alvin by the townspeople. His reputation was not helped by the fact that no one had seen Alvin's wife, Virginia, not even her family, in the 30 years she was married to Alvin.
What I couldn't understand, if she was mad at her family, why did she not go to the door for friends? So that kind of made me believe that maybe possibly he had given her instructions not to. He got angry at her, maybe, told her not to. And the thought crossed my mind, maybe she was being kept captive.
What went on in Alvin Ridley's secluded house was the subject of town gossip. But on the morning of October 4th, 1997, it became news. Virginia Ridley was found dead in her bed, fully clothed. By the time medical personnel arrived, rigor mortis had set in, an indication that she had been dead for at least 8 hours. Trixie LaCroix was asked to identify her sister's body.
I could not do it. I could not do it. So my sister's husband was with her, and the two of them went in, and she came back out and she said, I'm so glad you didn't go in. It was not a pretty sight. She said, her hair has not been combed in years. It has so many knots in it. It has not been combed in years. She can't weigh 90 pounds. She's skin stretched over bone.
New rumors began to surface in Ringgold, Georgia, about Alvin Ridley and the role he might have played in his wife's death. In October of 1997, Virginia Ridley was found dead in a house with no phone, no running water, and infested with ants and cockroaches. She had been dead at least 8 hours before medical personnel arrived, which prompted questions. Why had it taken her husband, Alvin, so long to call for help? Virginia's sister, Trixie LaCroix, believes if he had called earlier, her sister might still be alive.
There's no doubt in my mind that this man was responsible, directly or indirectly, for my sister's death. You cannot convince me of anything else.
Investigators traced Alvin's steps on the morning of Virginia's death.
You wait. Honey.
Alvin said that when he woke up, his wife was dead. He got into his truck and went looking for a telephone. He admitted driving by the local fire station, which could have provided emergency assistance. Instead, he continued driving to a telephone outside of town. He did not call the local hospital 10 minutes away. Instead, he called a hospital in Chattanooga, Tennessee, some 30 miles away. They told him to dial 911 for local assistance, which he finally did, leaving this message.
911, where's your emergency? 134 Emmons Street. What's the problem? I think my wife passed out. 134 Inman Street? Yeah. Is she breathing? I don't think so. It's behind the steel plant. I'm calling from a payphone booth. You don't have a phone at your house? There's no phone there. There's no phone there.
Investigators were struck by the lack of concern in Alvin's voice. It was unlike most emergency calls they receive. The initial examination of Virginia's body was done by the local coroner, Vanita Hollander. In Virginia's eyes, the coroner found petechial hemorrhages, which are broken blood vessels often seen in cases of strangulation or smothering deaths.
Decedent is a female in her late 40s. Decedent is malnourished, killed hemorrhages around her eyes.
The next day, a full autopsy was performed. The medical examiner, Dr. Frederick Hellman, found something not noted during the initial examination: deep bruising on the muscles of Virginia Ridley's neck, another possible indication of strangulation. Virginia Ridley's death was ruled a homicide, and her husband Alvin was charged with murder. To those in Ringgold who knew Alvin Ridley as Crazy Alvin, the news came as no surprise.
Everybody thought he killed his wife back in the 60s or the early 70s. And there was even talk that he killed her long, long time ago. And then one day he calls 911 and there's a recently dead body in the bed. And that's his wife.
Because of the petechial hemorrhages in the eyes and the condition of the body, the coroner suspected foul play, and police could find no indication that Virginia had received routine medical care in the recent past.
I think they checked a 50 to 100-mile radius. No doctor, no physician, no pharmacy, no hospital. This girl had not been anywhere in 30 years.
The town of Ringgold was gearing up for the biggest trial in its history, and investigators were in for another surprise when Alvin Ridley gave his explanation for how his wife died. Trixie LaCroix regularly visits the grave of her sister, a woman with whom she has more contact in death than she did in life. That's because Trixie and the rest of her family hadn't seen Virginia at all during the 30 years she lived with Alvin Ridley, the man now accused of her murder.
I will say this, that if there is a God Almighty above, if there is a day of reckoning for all of us, which I believe there is, I would not want to be him.
Alvin Ridley steadfastly maintained his innocence.
I felt terrible, sad, depressed because I lost a loved one that cared a lot about me. We was married 30 years. Sweet, happy Christian married life. I never hit her a time, she never hit me a time while we was married. Of course, we got in a few arguments, but that's all.
Alvin's defense attorney, McCracken Poston, knew that the case against his client wouldn't be easy. Alvin's reputation and behavior after his wife's death made his defense a unique challenge.
Several members of my family just said, he's crazy, he's capable of anything. I was about to get married, and several members of my wife's family were fearful of my getting involved in defending Alvin. Alvin had developed for himself somewhat of a reputation as a panhandler or a con man.
Poston visited Alvin's rundown house on the edge of town. and amid the cockroaches and broken windows, saw something he hadn't expected. The walls of the house were plastered with handwritten notes.
Some were letters to Congress that Alvin had written, but I began to notice a distinct handwriting that I knew was not Alvin's. And I asked him, "Who wrote this?" He said, "Well, Virginia did." And I grabbed a piece off the wall and, said, "Alvin, this will save you. I've got to have all of this."
There were hundreds of notes, all apparently in Virginia Ridley's handwriting. Some dealt with everyday matters like what she had watched on television. In notebooks, entire chapters of the Bible had been transcribed repeatedly, but most were love letters to Alvin. Ken Poston did not believe the love notes were the writings of a woman being held against her will, but could he prove to a jury that Virginia had actually written the notes? Brian Carney, a forensic document examiner, analyzed the letters. Carney had little to work with, but he did have some known signatures of Virginia Ridley on some official documents written years earlier, and he found a number of unmistakable similarities.
The obvious features that you can see just at a glance are, for example, the three I's in Virginia's are very tall, comparatively speaking. They're lowercase letter forms, cursive writing, but if you were to draw a horizontal line right across the top of this I all the way to the end of the name, you would see that all of the I's are taller than the other internal letter forms. And you scan down through the series in comparison of question to known, you can clearly see that this I feature is a habitual writing movement of this particular writer. And I was able to state that there were strong indications that Virginia was the writer of the comparable entries. So what we're essentially talking about is those letter combinations that are the same as the name Virginia, and the signatures that have the given name Virginia in them.
Virginia's family told investigators that Virginia suffered from epilepsy as a child. Epilepsy is a neurological condition in which uncontrolled electrical charges from the cerebral cortex can result in violent seizures and convulsions. According to her writings, Virginia had stopped taking her epilepsy medication years earlier, relying instead on her faith in God to heal her. The defense consulted Dr. Braxton Wanamaker, who is a neurologist. He said the petechial hemorrhages around Virginia's eyes were consistent with what is called sudden death epilepsy. Dr. Wanamaker says sudden death epilepsy occurs in patients who stop taking their medication or haven't been properly diagnosed.
I've had other patients who are sleeping with their spouses and they wake up and find that their spouse is dead. So people may or may not witness the seizure, and there are some of us who are not certain that all of these deaths are associated with seizure per se, but may have some epileptic activity in the brain that changes heart rhythms or changes respiratory mechanisms such that people die from that.
Alvin Ridley said his wife had seizures on a regular basis. He said she had a particularly bad one on the night before she died.
After she had the seizure and got over with, I says, "Are you going to be all right?" And she smiled at me and says, "Yes, honey, I love you." So, you know, I thought she'd be all right, so I went off to sleep.
But according to Alvin, she was dead when he tried to wake her the next day. Alvin said the seizures were the reason no one had seen Virginia in all those years. She was so embarrassed about her seizures, she wanted no contact with the outside world, not even her family. But the defense had one last hurdle: how to explain the bruising on Virginia Ridley's neck, evidence that the medical examiner said pointed to homicide. Judge Ralph Van Pelt presided over Alvin Ridley's murder trial and immediately had him evaluated by a psychologist.
He certainly probably would have qualified, I think, for mentally ill under the Georgia statute, but that's only if you're found guilty but mentally ill. The report indicated that he was competent to stand trial, could assist his attorney in a defense, and knew right from wrong.
At the trial, Alvin's defense team needed to refute the prosecution's contention that the bruises on Virginia Ridley's neck were evidence of strangulation. Dr. Robert Goldberg, a forensic pathologist hired by the defense, discovered that an employee in the coroner's office had drawn blood from Virginia Ridley's neck for a toxicology test, which was a complete break from standard procedure.
This is highly irregular and is something that procedurally is an error.
When the autopsy was conducted the next day, Dr. Goldberg believes the needle marks had developed into bruises, which are known as artifact, a term for any changes in a body caused by post-mortem evaluation.
I think it would be absolutely essential that any coroner have some autopsy experience. Even if they don't conduct the autopsy themselves, they should know the appropriate procedures. It was clear to me that this coroner was way out of line with appropriate procedure.
In Georgia, the coroner is an elected official, and this was the first suspicious death Anita Hollander investigated after her election. Alvin's attorney believes that the coroner's inexperience and her own personal suspicions about Alvin Ridley affected her judgment.
When that body went to the state crime lab and she accompanied it, she reported when they arrived, this woman has been locked in a basement for 30 years. The state pathologist that conducted the autopsy, I think that was an improper suggestion based on no fact that made it easy for him to conclude homicide by asphyxiation.
Alvin Ridley took the stand in his own defense. He said he drove by the local fire station after his wife's death because he had had a prior run-in with the people there and didn't trust them. He said he called the hospital in Chattanooga because that's where he'd taken his mother years earlier. It was the only facility he was familiar with. After 2 hours of deliberation, the jury acquitted Alvin Ridley of all charges. He claims it was his wife, Virginia, testifying through her letters, who kept him from a life behind bars.
I feel like my wife actually, and the Lord saved me in the church.
Alvin Ridley still lives in the same dilapidated home on the outskirts of town, and still talks about restarting his television repair business. He visits Virginia's grave regularly, a privilege he enjoys because of the role science played in proving his innocence.
I guess he was a strange man. I understood him to be a hermit. I understood him not to have the social skills that the rest of society has. And unfortunately, I believe that had a great deal to do with the fact that he was tried. Fortunately, the truth went out, and he was acquitted.
Good Lord. If it hadn't been for this scientific evidence, the risk was so high that the local community prejudices and biases about Alvin Ridley and his years and years of strange behavior would have been difficult to overcome.
I think it's a story about how the system works, that someone has their right to make the state prove that they're guilty, prove that they did it beyond a reasonable doubt. And a fellow with just very modest resources was able to come in and prove that he was not guilty, establish that he was not guilty.
Within weeks of opening her medical clinic, Dr. Kathleen Holland had 7 infants who stopped breathing and had seizures severe enough to require emergency resuscitation in her office. Considerably more than what most pediatricians see in an entire year. When one of the children died, local health officials demanded answers. Kerrville, Texas is a quiet little community just an hour's drive from San Antonio. Although Kerrville is primarily a retirement community, Dr. Kathleen Holland saw a business opportunity. She opened what was only the 2nd pediatric clinic in Kerrville. Reed and Patty McClellan were excited by the prospect of a female pediatrician coming to town.
A lot of mothers do want to take their kids, particularly if it's a girl, to a female doctor. And this was a young doctor, a progressive doctor, somebody that seemed to kind of breathe a little bit of fresh air into the medical community there and had training in the latest techniques.
The McClellan's daughter, Chelsea, was one of Dr. Holland's first patients when she opened her practice in 1982. Chelsea was 15 months old.
Chelsea arrived on the very first day of practice. Mom called reporting that she was breathing funny and had done so again previously 2 months ago.
Just moments after Dr. Holland finished the evaluation, Chelsea stopped breathing and had to be rushed by ambulance to the Sid Peterson Memorial Hospital. There, emergency room doctors revived Chelsea, but tests could not reveal what caused the incident. Just 1 month later, Chelsea visited Dr. Holland's office again, this time for a routine vaccination. After being given the shot, Chelsea stopped breathing, turned blue, and had a seizure. Once again, the child was rushed to Peterson Memorial Hospital where she was stabilized. Later that day, Chelsea was taken by ambulance to San Antonio to be evaluated by specialists. Dr. Holland was following the ambulance in her own car. Along the way, Chelsea went into cardiac arrest. The ambulance pulled off the road so Dr. Holland could assist in the resuscitation.
I jumped into the ambulance and started doing CPR and asked them where the closest facility was, which was Comfort. And so we pulled into the closest facility. And unfortunately, she did not respond to all of the efforts to bring her back. And so after about 20 minutes or more in the hospital, as well as all of the efforts en route, she was pronounced dead.
The autopsy concluded that Chelsea died of cardiac arrest attributed to sudden infant death syndrome, which usually occurs in children under 1 year of age.
Chelsea had been premature and had some breathing problems at birth, but by all accounts, medical accounts, she had outgrown that problem. And SIDS is something that afflicts kids who are younger. I mean, certainly doctors can speak about that more authoritatively, but generally you don't have kids dying of SIDS at the age of 15 months.
Over the next several weeks, Dr. Holland had more emergencies. A 5-month-old girl started choking and was unable to breathe, and she too had to be rushed to the hospital. A few days later, yet another child had a seizure which required emergency treatment. In the first month of practice, Dr. Holland had 7 children who suddenly and unexpectedly stopped breathing, had seizures, and required emergency hospitalization.
Some of them were indeed life-threatening. Had ambulances coming in on more than a weekly basis. That was totally astonishing. It was totally unprecedented in Kerrville, where they don't even have very many young families with children. So ultimately, other doctors who were just watching this blizzard of activity got very suspicious and started asking questions.
And those suspicions led medical investigators to reopen their inquiry into Chelsea McClellan's death. In the first month of practice, Dr. Kathleen Holland had 7 children who experienced seizures and breathing problems in her office, severe enough to require hospitalization. One of those patients, 15-month-old Chelsea McClellan, died of cardiac arrest on the way to the hospital. Administrators at Peterson Memorial Hospital asked Dr. Holland to attend a formal meeting to discuss the situation.
I was considered a prime suspect. And my practice obviously fell back as a result. It put a great strain on my marriage at the time. And financially, things were falling apart.
During the meeting, Dr. Holland reviewed each of the cases for the committee. She said all of the incidents could be explained by the children's medical histories.
Chelsea was born premature and had a history of breathing problems, even before coming to me.
One member of the committee asked Dr. Holland if she used the drug succinylcholine in her practice. Succinylcholine is a powerful muscle relaxant which can cause respiratory failure in large doses. It's so powerful, it's sometimes used in lethal injections for executions. Dr. Holland said she had a vial in her office but had never used it. They also asked Dr. Holland if she trusted her employees. Dr. Holland said she did. That night, after office hours, Dr. Holland spoke with her nurse, Janine Jones. Dr. Holland described Jones's behavior that night as suspicious.
There was a lull in the conversation, and the next thing she said was, "Oh, by the way, I found that missing vial of succinylcholine." And I said, "What missing vial of succinylcholine?"
I told you before. I lost a vial of succinylcholine and ordered a replacement for it. And I found the missing bottle, so now we have 2 vials.
Dr. Holland suspected it was more than a mere coincidence that her nurse mentioned the exact same drug doctors asked her about in the meeting.
And I'm just sitting there, and I'm absorbing all of this. And I'm putting it in perspective with the emergency, the meeting regarding my emergencies.
The next morning, Dr. Holland went to the refrigerator and found the 2 vials of succinylcholine. Both appeared to be full, but in one of the caps, she noticed 2 tiny needle marks.
And at that point in time, my whole world collapsed. And I remember being emotionally just in turmoil that morning, just absolutely in turmoil.
Dr. Holland immediately turned the vials over to the authorities.
Dr. Holland was within our circle of suspicion. Dr. Holland was very defensive in our investigation because she felt that as the captain of the ship, so to speak, that she was responsible for this child's death. And bear in mind, at that time, she was anticipating a flood of lawsuits from the parents.
Janine Jones was also under suspicion. Jones was a 33-year-old licensed vocational nurse, divorced with 2 children, who had come to Kerrville after leaving a job in a pediatric intensive care unit in San Antonio.
She was sort of rough and ready personality. She was very coarse, rough. She cursed like a sailor. She talked about sex a lot, even though she wasn't an attractive woman. She kind of liked to, mix it up and give people a hard time.
The 2 vials of succinylcholine were sent to the forensic lab for testing. Although the vial with the 2 needle holes appeared to be full, tests indicated that 80% of the vial had been filled with water. A large dose of succinylcholine could have caused Chelsea McClellan's death. Unfortunately, it was considered to be untraceable.
It's the type of drug that after injection into the body, it rapidly disappears and it's not traceable in its original form, because succinylcholine is made up of succinic acid and choline, which are natural elements in the human body.
And without hard scientific evidence, all investigators had were Dr. Holland's suspicions and Janine Jones' denials. District Attorney Ron Sutton was beginning to suspect that 15-month-old Chelsea McClellan and some of the other children in Dr. Holland's pediatric clinic had been intentionally injected with succinylcholine, a powerful muscle relaxant.
Every child who is of a non-talking age that came into this clinic with a potentially serious medical problem suddenly had a seizure. If the child was a talking age child or some other problems, just a sniffle or something like that, didn't get it. But if they had a potentially serious problem and a non-talker, they got it.
A vial of succinylcholine in Dr. Holland's office appeared to be full, but had 2 needle holes in the cap and had been refilled with water. The prime suspect was Dr. Holland's nurse, Janine Jones, since she was in the ambulance with Chelsea McClellan when she went into cardiac arrest and died. While all this was going on in Kerrville, there were similar suspicions about Janine Jones in San Antonio. Just 1 year earlier, death rates rose dramatically in the pediatric intensive care unit at Bexar County Hospital while Janine Jones was working there. Dr. Vincent DeMaio, the chief medical examiner for Bexar County, heard suspicions about Janine Jones from some of his medical colleagues.
After a while, it became common knowledge, and it became a kind of a morbid joke that if you were going to have deaths in the pediatric care unit, it was always on the shift that Janine Jones was working.
Dr. DeMaio passed this information on to Deputy District Attorney Nick Rothy, who discovered that the death rates dropped as soon as Janine Jones left the hospital.
We could tell that when Jones left, those peak numbers dropped immediately. The month she left, the day after she left, things just leveled out. It stayed level. They were level going in and then just peaked right there. And then the minute she left, I'd say almost in a minute, I mean to the day, they went back to what normal levels.
Officials in San Antonio called in the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, the premier medical investigation agency in the world. Dr. Gregory Istrie was the epidemiologist assigned to analyze the death rates in the intensive care unit.
The fact that the deaths appear to have been declining in the late 1970s, in 1980, early 1981, and then seemed to go up again in 1981-82. And the fact that that increase was almost exclusively on the evening shift or in the evening hours made us think that there really was something unusual that was going on there.
The rise in the intensive care death rates coincided with the dates Janine Jones worked there, and Jones worked the 3 to 11 shift. But there were more than 200 individuals who passed through the pediatric intensive care unit: doctors, nurses, aides, ward clerks, therapists, technicians, and medical residents. Dr. Istrie began his investigation by assigning each employee a number. He charted which of the 200 individuals were on duty at the time of the 30 suspicious deaths and the 50 or so unexplained medical emergencies.
Nurse 32 had a significant and quite extraordinarily high risk of deaths to patients when Nurse 32 was working compared to when Nurse 32 was not working. In fact, that risk was 10 times higher. The risk of death was 10 times higher when she was working compared to when she was not working.
And the identity of nurse number 32?
Nurse 32 was Janine Jones. Is Janine Jones.
Prosecutors found evidence that supervisors in the intensive care unit strongly suspected Janine Jones was somehow involved in these mysterious deaths.
So they conducted a study, began to focus on Janine Jones, but decided what to do would be to eliminate the LVNs from the staff and only staff the unit with registered nurses, thus getting Janine out of the picture. Dr. Holland asked hospital staff down there if Janine would be a good choice for her to ask to come to Kerrville with her, and they said yes, that she would be a good choice and a good nurse for her. Therefore, San Antonio got rid of Janine, sent her to Kerrville.
The suspicious deaths in the intensive care unit stopped after Janine Jones left, and the incidents mysteriously resurfaced in the medical practice where Jones was next employed. Prosecutors were convinced that 15-month-old Chelsea McClellan had been murdered by an intentional injection of succinylcholine, a powerful muscle relaxant. But they had no way to prove it, since there were no toxicology tests sensitive enough to find succinylcholine in the human body. But prosecutors heard about a forensic scientist in Philadelphia, Dr. Frederick Reeders, who was conducting research on drugs like succinylcholine. Chelsea McClellan's autopsy samples were sent to Dr. Reeders, who took them to the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. There, an experimental protocol permitted Chelsea's tissues to be analyzed with gas chromatography. This process heats and separates the various molecules in the samples, then measures the speed at which they separate from one another. In a scientific first, traces of succinylcholine were discovered in Chelsea McClellan's embalmed tissues.
We have the hypothesis of our finding that we are reasonably certain that this child was administered succinylcholine at or around the time of her death, or at or around the time of her onset of the symptoms and signs that then led to her death.
Janine Jones was charged with the murder of Chelsea McClellan and pleaded not guilty. Prosecutors believe that Janine Jones first injected Chelsea McClellan with succinylcholine in the examining room while Dr. Holland was busy with Chelsea's mother, and later injected Chelsea again in the ambulance, causing her death. The discovery of succinylcholine in Chelsea McClellan's tissues, the diluted vial with the needle holes found in Dr. Holland's office, and the fact that Janine Jones was alone with each of the infants at the time of their seizures all told a story.
The last witness, I believe, that testified in the Kerrville case in Georgetown testified that she went up to Janine standing outside of Sid Peterson Hospital. And Janine had said, you know, what this place needs, or at some point she said this, that what this place needs is a pediatric intensive care unit. And obviously she would want to be the head nurse. And this other person said, I think it was another nurse, said, well, but Janine, we don't have any critically ill children like that out here. And Janine said, yes, you do. You just need to go out and find them.
On February 16, 1984, Janine Jones was found guilty of the murder of Chelsea McClellan by injection of succinylcholine and was sentenced to 99 years in prison. In a later trial, Janine Jones was also convicted of 1 count of injury to a child while working at Bexar County Hospital in San Antonio, specifically for injecting an infant with 22,000 units of heparin, a near fatal dose. For that crime, Janine Jones was sentenced to an additional 60 years in prison.
What had happened, what Janine was doing was injecting these children with a drug called heparin, which is a blood thinner. And because it's a blood thinner, these children's little wounds wouldn't coagulate. And consequently, they started oozing blood from all these stick marks.
Janine Jones began creating havoc in the intensive care unit in San Antonio because of what prosecutors believe was her contempt for some of the doctors and registered nurses who worked there.
But she was still an LVN. She didn't have the education they had, and she wasn't going to go as far as they were going to go. And I think she resented that.
And when Janine Jones left San Antonio, she continued her rampage in Kerrville.
There's so many people that could have indeed stopped Janine Jones at some point. could have done the right thing and failed to do it. I mean, it's really a story about the medical bureaucracy. It's a story about medical politics. It's a story about institutions that fail to do what they should do for all the wrong reasons, that are afraid of bad publicity and scandal and litigation. And so allow Janine Jones to go off and harm kids in Kerrville and murder Chelsea McClellan. That's what makes it a truly tragic tale.
Dr. Holland says she relied on the positive employment reference Bexar County Hospital provided for Janine Jones before hiring her. Despite a broken marriage, numerous lawsuits, and near bankruptcy, Dr. Holland stayed in Kerrville, Texas to rebuild her practice. She says it has taken years to regain the trust of the community.
In February of 1984, the practice was down to seeing 4 patients a week. My husband divorced me before the year 1982 was closed. While those who had worked with me before knew of my own character and knew that I wasn't involved, my professional reputation was totally gone, especially in this town. And so I found myself at rock bottom. But I knew I hadn't participated in that crime. And I knew that, and I knew God knew that. And I just made a decision that I wasn't going to quit and I wasn't going to leave. I had nothing to run from.
A prostitute told police that some local drug dealers may have killed someone in her basement, but police could find no evidence of violence in the home. The only clue investigators found was a piece of used chewing gum. Scientists wondered whether it would help solve the mystery. Easton, Pennsylvania is the first city you come to when driving from New York City on the new interstate highway, Route 78. By day, Easton proudly displays its picturesque downtown and colonial-era architecture. But by night, drug dealers stroll the streets, since they can make more money than in New York City.
They can do better here. Less competition, maybe not as a violent scene as in New York and New Jersey, and so it's been a magnet and easy access.
And with the drug traffic has come an increase in violence. On August 5th, 1996, a prostitute, Kathy Sagusty, ran to her neighbor's home saying she'd been stabbed in the arm by 2 local drug dealers.
Kathy Sagusty, she was known to us from some prostitution arrests, and one of our other local PDs had also had her on some credit card matters. She was basically a crack cocaine addict who was doing prostitution and petty crimes to support her habit.
Sagusty identified her attackers as 19-year-old Corey Mayweather and 20-year-old Kwame Henry. Sagusty said they had been doing drugs together, and she was stabbed in the arm after a minor dispute. And during her interview, Sagasti reluctantly told police another story about an incident that happened in her home just 1 week earlier. She said these same two drug dealers, Corey Mayweather and Kwame Henry, along with a third man, Stanley Obas, came to her home with a 19-year-old woman, Mataron Smith. Smith was a drug runner whom the men suspected of stealing $2,000 worth of cocaine.
What the hell is going on down there? I'm going to see what you guys are doing.
After they took Smith to the basement, Sagasti heard Smith cry. Sagasti admitted she was using drugs at the time and never saw what happened. But she believed that Smith had been murdered. She said the three men later carried a large box from her basement.
She relayed about a fight, and they went to the basement, and she heard screams and cries from this girl, and then silence. And then she relayed that she never saw this girl again.
As we canvassed the neighborhood, we wound up finding some people at a local business. Some secretaries were looking out the window, and they saw three black males carrying a large, heavy box and really struggling with it.
But police were suspicious for a number of reasons. First, they could find no traces of blood or evidence of violence in Kathy Sagasti's basement. And second, they could find no record of any 19-year-old woman by the name of Mataron Smith. When police arrested Corey Mayweather for the stabbing of Kathy Sagasti, he denied any knowledge of Mataron Smith or her whereabouts. Without a body or any corroborating forensic evidence, all police had to go on were the suspicions of an admitted drug user. Two weeks had passed since Kathy Sagasti told police about the 19-year-old woman, Mataron Smith, whom she suspected was murdered in her basement. In a cemetery near Sagasti's home, a worker noticed an unusual smell coming from a burial vault. Burial vaults had once been used to store bodies during the winter months when the ground was too hard and cold to dig the graves. But this burial vault had long since been abandoned. Inside, the man made a gruesome discovery. Underneath some newspapers was the partially clothed, badly decomposed body of a black female. Coroner Zachary Lysek was called to the scene.
It was very cool and damp inside the dead house at the time. There was a very foul odor of decomposition. There was thousands of flies flying around and several thousand maggots that were crawling over the floor and over the body.
One hand was wrapped with twine, an apparent restraining device. The victim's pants were down around her ankles. She was about 5'2" and approximately 110 pounds. The newspapers that covered the body were many weeks old and were no help in identifying the time of death. The vault had been bolted from the outside, which provided some important information about the possible cause of death.
She could not have put herself in the dead house and then put a bolt on the outside of the door. So we knew that she had to have been placed there by someone else.
The manner of death was a homicidal violence, that she certainly didn't die from an accident or natural causes. It was some act of homicide. But we could not say whether her throat was cut because the throat area had been eaten away by maggot infestation, and there was no way to give an opinion. We couldn't say whether she was stabbed. We couldn't say whether she was strangled.
Police assumed the body was that of Mataron Smith. The 19-year-old drug runner Kathy Sagasti suspected had been murdered in her house. But forensic tests quickly dispelled that notion. This victim was much younger than 19 years old. An analysis of her teeth indicated she was in early puberty.
I believe she was 13. We were able to tell from the level of eruption of certain teeth that, that was consistent with somebody who might have been 13 at the time, even though I don't believe she had any baby teeth left.
To find out when the victim died, scientists turned to the only evidence they had, the insects that were on the dead body.
Some of the species of flies will be found almost immediately after death, within a matter of seconds to a matter of a few minutes after death. They'll be laying eggs within the first 2 hours, 3 hours after death, given the adequate environmental conditions. If it's 80 degrees, it's a nice summer day, and we have sunlight, daylight, the flies will be out searching, and if you die, they're going to find you very, very fast.
Dr. Haskell discovered that the larvae on the body were third stage. When he allowed some of these larvae to develop into full maturity, he discovered that the species was Phormia regina, otherwise known as the black blowfly, a species common in rural areas during the summer. If Dr. Haskell could determine how long the larvae had been on the body, he would know when the victim died. But temperature and weather conditions can affect insect development and must be taken into account.
If we have temperatures in the 80s or 90s or pushing 100, those maggots will grow and develop very, very fast. So it is critical to have the weather information to evaluate, to see whether that growth and development is slow, medium, or fast.
Dr. Haskell researched local temperatures in the weeks and months preceding discovery of the body. He also needed to calculate the difference between the outside temperatures and those inside the vault, which were much cooler. So he took temperature readings inside the vault and correlated them with the outside temperatures. With these calculations, and knowing the larvae were in their third stage of development, Dr. Haskell estimated that blowflies deposited their eggs on the dead body between July 27th and the 29th. This was the same time Kathy Sagusty suspected the murder took place in her basement. But if the victim wasn't 19-year-old Mataron Smith, who was she? When police discovered the decomposed body of a young woman in a deserted cemetery vault, they had few clues to her identity. An analysis of the victim's teeth revealed she was just 13 years old. Police conducted a nationwide computer search on all missing 13-year-old black females who were 5'2" and 110 pounds. The name, Richeza Williams, was one of the matches. Richeza Williams was a runaway from a middle-class family in Long Island, New York, and was reported missing by her family a few weeks earlier. When her dental records were compared to the teeth of the victim, there were similarities.
It was a difficult situation, but fortunately, she had some chipping of her upper front teeth. And we noticed that when we examined the remains, that there was also chipping on the upper front teeth, and they matched up remarkably well. And our conclusion was, within a high degree of dental certainty, that that individual was Richeza Williams.
Yeah, we're just here for some follow-up questions about the other day.
When Kathy Sagusty was shown the photograph of Richeza Williams, she confirmed that she was the woman she knew as 19-year-old Mataron Smith. Williams had changed her age and identity after she ran away from home. For Sandra Taylor, Richeza's teacher and Girl Scout leader, news of her death came as a shock.
I had no idea that she would eventually go somewhere and pose to be 19 instead of 13. Richeza was an exceptionally beautiful young girl. Beautiful black flowing long hair, very pleasant for anybody to look at, just gorgeous, nice personality, very friendly, friendly to everybody, people she knew, people she didn't know.
After Richeza finished grade school, she didn't attend middle school regularly. Her father died. Richeza started to rebel and became a discipline problem.
I had a conversation with Richeza myself, and I told her, you must go to school, and I told her also that if she did not, I was going to have her move in with me, and I would see that she went to school, and I would pick her up and make sure she went there. So I knew there was some kind of problems going on there.
Instead, Richeza Williams got involved running drugs between New York and Pennsylvania, which is how she met Corey Mayweather, Kwame Henry, and Stanley Obas.
What's up? Hey, man.
Kathy Sagusty said that Mayweather and Henry accused Richeza of stealing some cocaine, and that Stanley Obas prevented Sagusty from going downstairs. Over the next several hours, Mayweather and Henry took several items from the kitchen before returning to the basement.
Miss Augusti could not tell us what happened down there, but she did hear sounds of crying from Richeza. Don't do this to me, you know. She heard sort of like slapping around, and that this young girl was pleading with them to stop whatever they were doing down there. At some point, all the noise stopped in the basement.
A search of Sagusti's home corroborated parts of her story. Several kitchen utensils tested positive for human enzymes, leading to speculation that they were used as implements of torture. Hairs consistent with Richeza Williams were also found in the basement.
Well, the case was a circumstantial evidence case, really, from the outset. Although we had Kathleen Sagusty, who was able to tell us that she knew the three men, that she saw Richeza Williams in her home on about this time frame, end of July time frame, no one could actually say what happened in that basement.
With no forensic evidence connecting the three men to Richeza Williams' murder, police returned to the cemetery vault a few weeks after the body was discovered. With screens, they sifted through all the debris on the floor of the vault. They found something unusual, a used piece of chewing gum.
It had been there probably for 10 days or so, maybe even 15 days before we found it. So when we found it, it was hard as a rock and wound up being very well preserved.
The gum was red and about 1.5 inches long. It was completely dried out and appeared to have the imprint of teeth marks. There was more news for investigators. Corey Mayweather had more than just a drug habit. He had a habit of constantly chewing big red brand gum and carried packs of it wherever he went. Police also remembered he was chewing big red gum when they questioned him about Richeza Williams' murder. The question now was whether it would work as evidence. The used piece of chewing gum found in the burial vault near Richeza Williams' body was the only piece of evidence that could tie Corey Mayweather and his two accomplices to the murder. The gum was sent for DNA testing to see if it contained saliva that could be matched to one of the suspects. But almost immediately, investigators realized they had made a mistake. The DNA test required scientists to remove a piece of the gum which would alter or destroy the teeth marks. Fortunately, investigators retrieved the gum before DNA testing started and sent it instead to a forensic odontologist for analysis. Preserving the gum without altering it presented a daunting challenge to Dr. Dennis Asen.
I think the problem that faced me at that time is how do we make a copy of this chewing gum without distorting the evidence, without destroying the evidence?
After freezing the chewing gum, Dr. Asen attempted to make a copy by mixing together a plastic derivative known as an alginate. He placed the alginate mixture into a mold and then placed the frozen piece of gum on top of it. When he removed the frozen gum, it left an impression in the mold, essentially a negative copy. Into that impression, he injected a substance called a polyvinyl, which hardens quickly but remains flexible. This process produces a permanent, virtually indestructible duplicate, what's known as an exemplar of the piece of gum found at the crime scene. The next step was to compare that exemplar with a cast of Corey Mayweather's teeth. As if trying to match a piece of a jigsaw puzzle, he ran the exemplar over the cast and found a perfect match.
Mr. Mayweather had a little crossbite. There was one tooth that was out of line, and it created a bit of a step and a ledge in his dentition. And in the gum, there is this step or ledge, and that was the focal point where we were able to seat the gum. It was very, very clear.
Dr. Asen believes that the gum fell from Mayweather's mouth when he carried Racheza Williams' body into the vault. Spitting it out would have distorted the bite marks. Prosecutors believe that the men brought Racheza Williams to Segusti's home to confront her about the missing cocaine. While in the basement, the men tortured her with various items they found in the kitchen. The lack of blood in the basement told investigators that Racheza Williams most likely had been strangled. Williams' body was undoubtedly inside the large cardboard box the three men carried from Segusti's basement as they headed in the direction of the nearby cemetery. But Corey Mayweather's mistake was the chewing gum that accidentally fell from his mouth as he carried Racheza Williams' body into the cemetery vault, proving he was inside the vault when the body was dumped. The insect activity on the body told forensic scientists when Racheza Williams had been murdered, which coincided with the date Kathy Segusti last saw Williams in her home. The blowfly larvae, the chewing gum, and Segusti's testimony all pointed to Corey Mayweather as the murderer.
I don't think he gave up until the bite mark evidence came back. That's really kind of what sunk his boat. They hired their own expert who basically came to the same conclusion we did. He had some very unique dentition and just kind of sold the case.
It really supports the fact that how important crime scene evidence is and how, the time needs to be taken to examine the scene thoroughly and look for every little piece of evidence. It may be something as simple as a piece of gum or a cigarette butt that helps you to identify who the suspect may be. And in this case, it proved to be positive.
The decision not to test the gum for DNA until after the dental analysis was a huge break for investigators. DNA tests conducted later on the gum for saliva were inconclusive. Had the DNA testing been done first, the dental impressions would have been destroyed, and prosecutors would have lost the only positive forensic evidence against Corey Mayweather. In October of 1998, Corey Mayweather pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and avoided the death sentence. He was sentenced to life in prison. He also implicated his two accomplices. Kwame Henry was not apprehended until several years later in Trinidad and was also sentenced to life in prison. Stanley Obos has never been apprehended and is still at large. Those who investigated this case were gratified by the outcome, but are still haunted by the fate of a beautiful 13-year-old girl who strayed despite the best efforts of family and friends.
She's still someone's child, and kids just get, rather strong-headed, sometimes way ahead of their years, and unfortunately she got in way over her head, and she's a person who'll never have a second chance to, right her mistakes.
Since this tragedy happened, believe you me, I have put this into my curriculum, and I talk about it in classroom, and I talk about it in chapel service with the children to let them know when you leave here, you have to beware of wolves in sheep clothing, and the Bible speaks of that. So I have to let them know what had happened in this situation so that it won't happen again.